Hello and welcome. I know many of you use these videos to help you fall asleep. So before we begin, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also comment where you're from and at what time you're watching. Take a moment to get comfortable, relax, and let yourself unwind. Name of the story: The Cursed Wedding Ring. When Lily found out that she had inherited a ring from her grandmother, she was curious but not particularly excited. She had never known the woman, and her mother had only ever spoken about her in vague, almost dismissive terms. She was a complicated person, her mother had said more than once. You wouldn't have liked her. The ring arrived in a small velvet box, tucked away in a package that had been sent from the house Lily's grandmother had lived in before she passed. Her mother had insisted that Lily go through the belongings, hoping to find something of value or significance. Lily wasn't sure what she expected, but the ring inside the box was far more beautiful than she had imagined. It was made of gold, with an intricate design around the band. The centerpiece was a large, smooth diamond, glowing faintly in the light. The moment Lily touched it, something odd washed over her. It was as if the air around her had thickened, and a strange sensation crawled up her spine. It was just a ring, she reminded herself. But why did it feel so alive? She slipped it onto her finger, admiring its weight. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made just for her. But as soon as she did, a rush of vivid images filled her mind. At first, they were just fleeting moments, flashes of a woman with dark, wavy hair, dressed in an old-fashioned white gown, smiling warmly at a man who seemed to be holding her hand. Lily blinked, trying to shake the images away, but they only became clearer. She could see the woman's face more distinctly now. She was beautiful, but there was a sadness in her eyes, a kind of emptiness that made Lily feel uncomfortable. The man beside her smiled, but his expression seemed strained. It was as though they were both trapped in a moment that didn't belong to them, a moment that could never be truly theirs. "Lily, are you okay?" Her mother's voice snapped her out of the trance. Lily looked down at the ring on her finger, heart racing. "Yeah, I'm fine," she replied, though her voice didn't sound like her own. It sounded distant, like it was coming from far away. Her mother gave her a curious look, but didn't press the issue. Instead, she left the room, closing the door behind her. But Lily couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She stood in front of the mirror, examining the ring closely. Her reflection stared back at her, but the woman in the image seemed different, as though she were wearing someone else's skin. The images of the woman in the wedding dress returned, clearer this time. She wasn't just a stranger. Lily recognized her now. The woman was her grandmother. But how could that be? Her grandmother had died long before Lily was even born. How could she see her, hear her thoughts, feel her emotions? Suddenly, a memory surfaced, one that wasn't hers. She was standing in a dimly lit room, her grandmother, no, the woman, standing in front of her, dressed in the same wedding gown. "I made a mistake," the woman whispered, her voice trembling. "I shouldn't have married him. But now I can't leave him." Lily's heart skipped a beat. She wanted to reach out, to ask who the woman was talking about, but the vision shifted, pulling her deeper into the memory. Now the woman was sitting in a small, dimly lit parlor, holding her hands tightly in her lap. A man sat opposite her, staring at her with cold, unforgiving eyes. His face was unfamiliar, but there was something about him that made Lily's chest tighten with fear. "I'm sorry," the man said, his voice low and menacing, "but you know what you have to do." Lily's hands clenched at her sides, her body shaking. The memory felt so real, so alive, like she was living it herself. Suddenly, the vision turned dark. The man's voice echoed in her mind, his words haunting her. "You'll regret this." Lily gasped, pulling her hand away from her face, as if she could escape the haunting vision by removing the ring. But the image remained, swirling in her mind like a storm. Her breath quickened, her pulse racing. Her grandmother's wedding. The curse. The tragedy. Everything was repeating itself. The world around Lily felt surreal. as if she had been ripped from her own life and thrust into someone else's. The images, the memories, none of it made sense, but she couldn't escape them. They felt too real, too vivid, and they continued to overwhelm her with each passing second. She couldn't just ignore it. The images wouldn't let her. The weight of the ring on her finger was like a constant reminder that something was wrong, something that she wasn't ready to understand. Lily pulled herself from the mirror, desperately trying to regain some sense of normalcy. She couldn't explain what was happening, but she knew one thing for certain. This ring was somehow tied to the strange memories. And whatever happened to her grandmother, whatever tragedy had befallen her, it was now haunting Lily too. As the night stretched on, Lily found herself unable to sleep. Her mind wouldn't stop racing. What had the man meant when he said, "You'll regret this"? And why did her grandmother look so broken, so trapped in a life she couldn't escape? She looked down at the ring once more. It gleamed under the moonlight, an innocent piece of jewelry, but Lily knew better. There was something darker, something far more sinister about it. Without thinking, she slid the ring off her finger and placed it on the nightstand beside her. But even with the ring removed, the weight of the memory lingered. The woman in the gown, the woman who was her grandmother, seemed to be watching her, waiting for something, waiting for Lily to understand. The clock ticked in the background, but the sound seemed to echo unnaturally, growing louder with each passing second. The room around her grew colder, the air thickening as though the walls themselves were closing in. The soft, barely audible whispers began again. At first, they were too quiet to make out, but they soon grew clearer. Lily couldn't distinguish the words, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate, full of regret. She closed her eyes, trying to shut out the whispers, but they only grew louder. "You can't escape him." Lily's eyes snapped open. She had heard it clearly this time. The voice was deep, almost guttural. It sounded like a man, but distorted, as if the words were being choked out by something. "You can't escape him." Lily's heart raced in her chest. She looked around, but the room was empty. The whispers, though, continued to fill the space around her. They didn't come from any particular direction. They were everywhere, surrounding her like a suffocating fog. She jumped out of bed, her hands shaking. She needed to get rid of the ring. Maybe if she destroyed it, the visions would stop. Maybe then she could find peace. Lily grabbed the ring off the nightstand and stared at it once more. The diamond caught the moonlight, almost as if it were glowing from within. The ring, now in her hand, felt heavier than ever. She stood there for a moment, torn between the fear of what the ring represented and the overwhelming urge to destroy it, to make everything stop. "You can't escape him." The words echoed in her mind again, a warning she couldn't ignore. She walked toward the kitchen, her footsteps slow and deliberate. She didn't know what she was going to do, but she had to do something, anything, to rid herself of the strange hold the ring had on her. As she reached for the knife in the drawer, a sudden chill ran down her spine. She turned quickly, heart pounding, but no one was there. The kitchen was just as it had always been, quiet, still, and undisturbed. Lily swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing. Maybe she was just imagining things. Maybe the stress of dealing with her grandmother's inheritance was getting to her. But the whispers wouldn't stop. They had become clearer now, like they were right next to her ear, and they carried with them an edge of malice. "You can't escape him." Lily froze, the knife still clutched in her hand. It wasn't just the whispers anymore. There was something else. Something moving, just beyond her reach. She could feel it. Then the temperature in the room dropped, the air thick with a presence she couldn't see, but could feel closing in on her. The lights above flickered, and then she heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Her breath caught in her throat. The steps weren't coming from the hallway or the front door. They were coming from behind her. They were coming from the shadows, just at the edge of her vision. Slowly Lily turned, but there was nothing there. The kitchen was empty. No one, no figure, just the soft, flickering light from the ceiling. But the footsteps continued, growing louder, closer. As if someone or something was walking right behind her, just out of sight. The whispers grew louder too, swirling around her, as if they were closing in from all directions. She backed away, clutching the knife tighter, her hand shaking with fear. And then the whispers stopped. Everything fell silent. The air was heavy, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Lily's heart hammered in her chest as she looked around. She couldn't escape. No matter how far she ran, the curse was following her. The man, the voice that kept haunting her grandmother's memories, was still here. He had always been here, and now Lily understood. The tragedy had never really been hers to escape. It had been her grandmother's, and now it was hers too. As the realization sank in, the temperature in the room dropped even further, and the door creaked open. Lily's eyes went wide in terror as she saw the shadow moving across the threshold. It was him. The shadow at the door was like a black void, its edges soft and fluid, as if it were a part of the darkness itself. Lily's breath hitched in her chest, a cold sweat dripping down her back. The figure didn't move, it just stood there, silent, watching her. Her heart raced, pounding in her ears, and she could feel her legs trembling beneath her. She wanted to run, but her feet felt like they were glued to the floor. Every instinct screamed at her to escape, but something about the figure held her in place. The whispering started again, now low and almost imperceptible. But this time, the voice wasn't distant. It was inside her head, curling around her thoughts, wrapping itself around her mind like a suffocating fog. You can't escape him, you're already a part of it. The words chilled her to the core, sending a shock of panic through her body. She took a step back, still clutching the knife, but the shadow didn't advance. It stayed just inside the doorway, its presence heavier than anything she had ever felt before. A soft, hollow laugh echoed from the darkness. It wasn't the laugh of a human. It was something colder, something more ancient. The laugh seemed to seep into every corner of the room, wrapping itself around her like a binding rope. It's already too late, Lily, the voice rasped. You're a part of the curse now. Just like her. Lily's chest tightened. She felt as if she were drowning in the air itself, her limbs heavy, the knife in her hand suddenly feeling like it was made of lead. She wanted to scream, to call out for help, but the words wouldn't come. Her throat was tight, her breath shallow. You'll see it soon enough, the voice continued, its tone dripping with malice. You'll see it all. The truth you've been trying to run from. You're tied to her now, and there's no way out. The shadow at the door began to move, but not in the way Lily had expected. It didn't step forward or walk, it shifted, fluid and unnatural, like a liquid shadow stretching across the floor. The edges of the darkness curled and wavered, and from within it, a form began to take shape. Lily's heart froze as the figure of a man appeared from the void. He was tall, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, and his body draped in dark, tattered clothing. He moved slowly, deliberately, the sound of his footsteps muffled by the thick air that seemed to follow him. It was him, the man from her grandmother's memory, the one whose voice had haunted her, the one who had caused the tragedy. And now, he was standing right in front of her. Lily tried to back away, but her legs felt like they were locked in place, frozen by fear. Her mind screamed for her to do something, to fight, but it was as though her body refused to obey. You should have listened, the man said, his voice low and gravelly like a distant storm. Now you're trapped. You will repeat her mistake. You will feel her pain. Forever. Lily's hand gripped the knife tighter, her knuckles turning white, but it felt useless. The man was too close now, his presence suffocating her. She could feel the weight of his gaze, even though she couldn't see his eyes. There was no escaping him. She thought she could outrun it. She thought she could escape the past. But it always catches up. It always pulls you back. The words seemed to sink into her chest, each one digging deeper into her soul. The man stepped closer, his breath cold against her skin, and Lily felt her heart pounding in her throat. She could feel the oppressive weight of history pressing down on her, her grandmother's history, her own fate intertwined with it. The ring, the curse, the tragedy. You'll see the truth soon enough. The truth of your grandmother's choices, of her regrets, and you will be forced to relive them, over and over, forever. The man's voice was deafening now, overwhelming her senses. She could no longer focus on the room around her. The whispers in her head grew louder, melding with his voice, drowning her in an ocean of sound. The coldness, the darkness, it was all closing in on her. And then the shadow reached out, not with hands, but with an unnatural pull, as if the darkness itself were trying to claim her. In that moment, Lily realized what she had to do. The man, the shadow, wasn't just a figure. He was part of the curse. He was the reason for everything that had happened to her grandmother. He had been the force that had bound her to the tragedy, and now he was trying to do the same to Lily. With all the strength she could muster, Lily pushed herself back, stumbling as she did. Her body was weak, her breath ragged, but she refused to give in. She had to fight, even if she didn't understand everything that was happening. She raised the knife, though her hands trembled with fear. The man didn't flinch. He just watched her, his mouth curling into a smile that didn't belong on a human face. It was twisted, distorted, like something that had crawled out from the very depths of hell. "You think that will stop me?" he chuckled, his voice rich with dark amusement. "You think you can escape the curse with a knife? You cannot defeat what you cannot see, what you cannot understand." But Lily didn't care. She didn't know how she was supposed to stop him, but she wasn't going to let him claim her too. She had to try. With a scream of desperation, Lily lunged forward, swinging the knife in a wide arc. But before it could connect, the shadow seemed to dissolve, swirling away into the air like smoke. The coldness vanished, the oppressive presence lifting, but the whispers didn't stop. They echoed in her mind, louder than ever. "You can't escape him." Lily's breath came in ragged gasps as the shadow dissolved into nothingness. For a moment, there was silence. The whispers, the coldness, the oppressive presence, all of it seemed to vanish, leaving Lily standing in the middle of the kitchen, trembling and confused. Her grip on the knife loosened, and it fell to the floor with a soft clink, as if the weight of the moment had left her entirely. She took a step back, her eyes darting around the room, but there was nothing. No shadow, no man. The kitchen was still. The only sound now was her own heavy breathing. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The absence of the shadow didn't bring relief. It brought dread. Something was still there, lingering in the air like a storm waiting to break. "You can't escape him." The voice rang in her mind again, a cruel echo. Lily staggered back, clutching her head, as if trying to force the words out of her skull. But they wouldn't leave. They were there, persistent, relentless. "You'll never escape. You're just like her." She shook her head violently, trying to shake the thoughts, the memories, the curse away. But the words only grew louder, their weight bearing down on her. Suddenly, the image of her grandmother flashed in her mind. Her sad, empty eyes, her wedding dress, the man who had haunted her. Lily saw it all again, the moments she had glimpsed before, the vision of her grandmother sitting alone in that dark, dimly lit room. The words that had been whispered back then echoed louder now. "I shouldn't have married him, but now I can't leave him." Lily's legs buckled beneath her, and she fell to her knees, the weight of the truth crashing down on her. She understood now. Her grandmother hadn't just been haunted by the man. She had been trapped in a life she couldn't escape, bound by a curse that had no end. And now it was Lily's turn. She had inherited the curse, inherited the ring. She had taken on the weight of the past, and it was already too late to turn back. The whispers began to grow in intensity again, louder than ever before. Lily closed her eyes, clutching her head, but the voices still rang in her ears. "You'll regret this." A flash of light, a memory, blinded her for a moment. The sound of wedding bells. a dark figure standing at an altar. A woman in a white gown, tears streaming down her face. You'll never escape him. Not now. The image is twisted, changed, and for a brief moment, Lily could see herself standing at the altar. Her hands trembled as she stared at the man in front of her. The same man, the same cold, empty gaze. She was the woman in the gown, her grandmother, living out the same tragic fate, in the same moment, in the same place. Her chest tightened as her throat closed up. She couldn't breathe. The man's face loomed closer, his smile twisted and unnatural. His voice rumbled in her mind, cold and harsh. You'll never escape me. Lily's hand flew to her throat, desperate for air, but it was like she was drowning in the air itself. The vision, the curse, it was suffocating her. It was dragging her back into the past, forcing her into a role she hadn't chosen. She was trapped in this cycle, this endless, repeating tragedy. But then something shifted. For the first time, the whispers began to fade. The pressure in her chest lessened, the coldness in the room lifted, and Lily's vision cleared. She opened her eyes and saw the ring on the floor, the same ring that had been haunting her for what felt like an eternity. Without thinking, she grabbed the ring and held it in her hand, staring at it. This was it. This was the source of everything. The reason she had been pulled into this nightmare. She had to destroy it. There was no other choice. She didn't know how, but she had to end this. She had to break the cycle before it consumed her like it had consumed her grandmother. With trembling hands, Lily rose to her feet. She glanced around the room, her eyes scanning for anything she could use to destroy the ring. But there was nothing. Just the same empty kitchen, the same shadows that seemed to hang in the corners, watching her. You can't destroy it, the voice said again, low and mocking. You'll never destroy it. It's already a part of you. Lily's mind raced. She couldn't think straight, couldn't focus. The pressure was too much, the curse too heavy. She could feel the weight of it on her chest, pressing her down. You'll never escape him. She could hear the man's voice again, his words sharp like a knife cutting into her thoughts. The shadows seemed to close in on her, and she felt a cold hand press against her back, a presence that was too close, too real. But Lily wasn't going to give in. She couldn't. With a cry of desperation, she hurled the ring across the room, sending it crashing into the wall. The ring bounced across the floor, coming to a stop in the far corner of the room. Lily's breath came in ragged gasps as she collapsed to her knees, the weight of the curse still heavy on her chest. She looked at the ring, lying motionless in the corner, its diamond gleaming faintly in the dim light. But nothing happened. The whispers didn't stop. The shadows didn't fade. Lily realized, with a sinking feeling in her stomach, that destroying the ring wouldn't stop the curse. It wasn't just the ring. It was something deeper, something older. It was already a part of her bloodline, a part of her. The man's voice echoed in her mind, victorious now. It's too late, Lily. Lily's fingers dug into the floor beneath her, her nails scraping against the cold wood. Her breath was shallow, her heart thundering in her chest, as the words of the man swirled in her mind, pushing her toward despair. It's too late, Lily. She couldn't escape. No matter how hard she tried, it was always there, lurking just beneath the surface of her thoughts, twisting the world around her. The shadows hadn't lifted, they remained, pressing in from all sides, suffocating the room. The whispers, too, continued, crawling into her mind like insects burrowing under her skin. She looked at the ring, now lying in the far corner of the room. The gleam of the diamond was almost hypnotic, pulling her gaze to it, as if the ring itself were alive. The feeling in her chest grew heavier, her limbs trembling with the weight of something ancient and cruel. You can't break it. It's part of you now. Lily forced herself to her feet, swiping a hand across her face, trying to clear the fog of dread that clouded her mind. There had to be a way out. There had to be a way to stop the curse before it consumed her completely. The man's voice was still with her, insistent, like a snake slithering through her thoughts. Your grandmother thought she could escape. She thought she could outrun me. But she couldn't. Lily turned toward the ring once again. Her grandmother had thought the same thing. She had believed that she could escape the past, that she could break free from the curse that bound her to that man, that tragedy. But she hadn't. And now Lily was trapped in the same web, caught in the same cycle of pain and despair. You're the same. You will always be the same, the voice murmured, cruel and taunting. She took a step forward, her eyes fixed on the ring, her mind torn between fear and determination. The curse had already been passed down through generations. It was alive, thriving in her bloodline. The whispers, the shadows, they were part of the curse, and they would never stop. They would always return, pulling her back to this place, to this moment. Lily's chest tightened as the reality of her situation settled in. There was no escaping it. She was bound to the curse, just as her grandmother had been. But then a thought struck her, a small, desperate hope. Could she fight it? Could she break the cycle? The man's voice laughed, deep and rumbling. You think you can fight it? You think you can change what has been set in motion for centuries? Lily squeezed her eyes shut, shaking her head in defiance. I have to try. Her voice was hoarse, barely a whisper, but it felt like the first declaration of freedom she had made in days. The room seemed to grow darker, the shadows stretching across the walls as if in response to her words. The pressure in her chest increased, but she fought against it. The whispers, the man's voice, they were just distractions. They were trying to break her. They wanted her to give in, to accept the fate that had been handed down to her. But Lily refused. She stepped toward the ring, her legs shaking beneath her, and reached down to pick it up. As her fingers closed around it, she felt a sudden jolt of electricity, as if the ring were alive, its power surging through her. She winced, but she didn't let go. She could feel the weight of it, both physical and emotional, a presence that filled her entire being. You can't stop it. You're mine now. You'll always be mine. The voice was louder now, almost deafening, but Lily gritted her teeth and held the ring tightly. She had to do something. She had to find a way to break this. Her mind flashed back to her grandmother's face, to the tears in her eyes as she had whispered those words. I should never have married him. But now I can't leave him. Lily's heart clenched as she realized the truth. Her grandmother hadn't just been haunted by the man. She had been trapped by him. The curse was a prison, one that kept her bound to that tragic fate, no matter how hard she tried to escape. And now Lily was in the same prison. But she wouldn't be like her grandmother. She wouldn't let the curse define her. Lily turned the ring over in her hands, staring at the diamond, her mind racing. The key was in the curse itself. It was tied to the ring, to the man, to the tragic love that had bound them together. But maybe, just maybe, she could turn it against them. You can't win, Lily. The man's voice was growing more frantic, more insistent. You can't fight what you can't see. Well, you can't understand. Lily's heart pounded in her chest, her fingers trembling as she held the ring in both hands. She needed to focus, to clear her mind, to understand what had to be done. She closed her eyes and whispered the words she had heard from her grandmother, the ones that had haunted her for so long. I break this bond. I break this curse. I choose to live free. The words felt strange on her tongue, foreign and old, like something from another time. But as soon as she spoke them, the air around her shifted. The temperature in the room dropped, and the shadows seemed to retreat, pulling away from her like a tide receding from the shore. For a moment, the whispers stopped. The man's voice fell silent. And then, with a sickening crack, the diamond in the ring shattered. Lily gasped, stumbling back as the shards of the ring fell to the floor like fragments of her nightmare. The darkness in the room flickered and writhed, as if struggling against something it could no longer control. The man's voice screamed, furious, but Lily didn't listen. She didn't care. She had done it. The curse was broken. But as the last remnants of the ring fell away, Lily felt a strange, cold emptiness wash over her. The weight in her chest lifted, but it left her feeling hollow, as if something vital had been torn from her soul. And in the silence that followed, Lily knew one thing for certain: the curse was gone. But at what cost? The house was still, the shadows no longer pressing in on her. The whispers had faded into the background, barely a memory now. But Lily knew that the darkness wasn't gone for good. It would always be there, lurking, waiting for someone else to inherit the curse. And for a brief moment, she wondered if she had truly escaped, or if she too had become part of the cycle, just another link in a chain that would never break. Lily stood in the middle of the room, her body trembling, as the silence pressed down on her like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The shards of the shattered ring lay scattered on the floor at her feet, their sharp edges gleaming faintly in the dim light. The house, which had once felt so alive with the curse's weight, now seemed empty, hollow, as if it had exhaled a long-held breath. But something was off. Her heart raced in her chest as she stared at the shards. The weight had lifted, yes, but there was an eerie stillness that she couldn't shake. Her mind felt unfocused, as if a part of her had been erased in the process of breaking the curse. She reached down, her fingers grazing the shards, but she recoiled, suddenly afraid to touch them again. "It's done," she whispered to herself, trying to convince her racing thoughts. "It's over." But deep down, a gnawing feeling remained, something she couldn't ignore. It was as if the darkness had been contained for now, but it hadn't been destroyed. It was simply lying in wait. She turned away from the broken ring and walked toward the door. She needed fresh air. She needed to leave this house, this place that had been a prison for her and for her grandmother. But as she reached the doorway, something caught her eye. A mirror hanging on the wall across from her. For a brief moment, she saw only her own reflection. Her pale face, her wide eyes, her hair disheveled from the stress of everything that had happened. But then, just as she was about to look away, she saw something else. In the reflection, behind her, a figure. Tall, dark, and cloaked in shadow. Lily froze, her breath catching in her throat. She whipped around, but there was nothing there. No shadow, no figure, just the empty room. Her hands trembled as she turned back to the mirror. And there it was again, the figure standing right behind her, its presence as cold and suffocating as the curse itself. The shadows seemed to ripple, almost alive, swirling around the figure, obscuring its features. Her heart hammered in her chest. She stepped back, her feet stumbling over the floor, as her mind scrambled for answers. The curse had been broken. She had shattered the ring. The man, the shadow, it should be gone. But it wasn't. You can never escape. The voice was low, but it wasn't the man's voice. It was something darker, something older. Lily spun toward the door, but it was no longer a simple exit. The hallway stretched out before her, longer than it had been moments ago, its walls closing in as if the house itself was shifting, warping. She could feel the presence behind her growing stronger, closer. The figure in the mirror smiled, a twisted, malevolent grin that seemed to stretch unnaturally across its face. "You think you've won?" the voice whispered, seeping into her mind like poison. "You've only just begun." Panic surged through Lily. She was trapped again. The house was alive, alive in a way she hadn't understood before. The curse wasn't just tied to the ring. It was tied to the house, to the land, to the very bloodline that had carried it for generations. She turned and bolted toward the door, her hand reaching for the handle, but as her fingers brushed against it, the wood groaned, and the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, as though the house itself was breathing. Lily stumbled back, her heart racing in her chest as the whispers began to rise again, louder this time, swirling around her like a storm. "You can't escape. Not now. Not ever." The air was thick, oppressive, pressing down on her as if the house were trying to consume her whole. The temperature dropped, and she could see her breath in the cold, heavy air. Every shadow in the room seemed to come to life, reaching for her, grasping at her limbs, pulling her toward the center of the room. She had thought she was free. She had thought she had broken the curse. But she hadn't. Lily's chest tightened as the realization hit her like a blow. The curse hadn't been destroyed. It had simply shifted. It had moved on from the ring, from the man, and now it was something else entirely. The house itself was cursed, and she was its prisoner. "You're one of us now," the voice purred, chilling and sweet. "You'll never leave." Lily's body felt like it was made of stone, her legs too weak to move, her heart too heavy to beat. The shadows closed in around her, and the air seemed to press against her skull, squeezing her thoughts into oblivion. She felt dizzy, disoriented, as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. With all the strength she could muster, Lily pulled herself back toward the broken shards of the ring. She needed to escape. She needed to find a way to break this, to destroy whatever evil was living within the house. Her hand closed around the largest shard, and as she lifted it, a flash of cold, jagged fear shot through her. She knew deep down that this wouldn't be enough. She couldn't just destroy the ring. She couldn't just break the house. This was bigger than her, bigger than anything she could comprehend. The whispers began again, but this time they weren't just in her mind. They were in the air around her, twisting and turning, wrapping themselves around her like a suffocating cloud. "You'll never be free. You'll never escape." Lily dropped the shard, her fingers numb, and sank to her knees, her head spinning. The walls closed in tighter, the shadows deeper, and the house seemed to pulse with a malevolent rhythm. It was like it was alive, its heart beating in time with her own, binding them together in a sickening embrace. And then, as she looked up one last time, the figure in the mirror came into focus, its face no longer obscured. It was her face, but it wasn't. It was the face of her grandmother, twisted in agony, her eyes hollow, her mouth stretched in a scream that was never-ending. Lily's breath caught in her throat. She had tried. She had fought. But in the end, there was no escaping this house. No escaping the curse. She was one of them now, and the cycle would continue. Forever. The house seemed to shift around her as Lily knelt on the cold floor, her eyes wide, her breath shallow. The whispers were now a constant hum, low and insistent, like a swarm of bees buzzing just beneath her skin. The shadows crept closer, curling around her like tendrils, wrapping her in their suffocating embrace. She could feel the weight of it now. The curse, the house, the cycle that had trapped her grandmother and now trapped her. It was all around her, pressing in from every side. Her hands shook as she tried to push herself to her feet, but the room seemed to twist, the walls narrowing, closing in on her. The floor beneath her feet felt like it was tilting, and she stumbled, almost losing her balance. Her grandmother's face in the mirror haunted her, the hollow eyes staring back, the twisted mouth frozen in an eternal scream. Lily had tried to break the cycle, but it was clear now. It was never meant to be broken. The curse wasn't just a bond to a ring or to the man who had caused all of this. It was a part of the very fabric of the house, the land, and the bloodline. "You are mine," the voice whispered again, closer now, almost like a breath on her neck. "You will always be mine." Lily pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block out the sound, but it didn't work. The voice was inside her head, inside her bones, echoing through every thought, every nerve. She could feel the house pulsing, the rhythm of its life blending with the rhythm of her own heart. The curse had taken root in her very soul, and there was no escaping it. Her legs felt heavy, as though the floor itself was trying to pull her down, pull her into the depths of the house, into the void where there was no escape. She reached for the broken shards of the ring again, hoping, no praying, that there was something left, something she could use to destroy it all. But as her fingers closed around the sharp fragments, she felt a cold rush of energy surge through her, sharper and more painful than anything she had ever experienced. "No," she whispered through gritted teeth. "This can't be happening." But it was. The energy thrummed through her like electricity, each pulse stronger than the last. The room seemed to stretch, the walls growing taller, the ceiling rising higher, as if the house itself was alive, growing, feeding on her fear. She looked up, her eyes searching for an escape, but there was none. The windows were dark and silent, the door still slammed shut. There was nowhere to run. And then, in the distance, through the endless corridors of the house, she saw it. A figure, shrouded in shadow, moving toward her. The air seemed to ripple as the figure advanced, the shadows twisting around it like smoke. Lily's heart raced, her breath catching in her throat. The man, the one who had caused all of this, the one whose curse had destroyed her family, trapped them in an endless cycle of suffering and despair. She tried to move, but her body wouldn't obey. Her legs were frozen in place, her chest tight, her heart pounding in her ears. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if they were feeding off her terror, growing stronger with every passing second. The figure drew closer, its shape becoming clearer, and Lily could see his face. It was her grandmother's husband, the man who had cursed them all. His face was gaunt, his skin stretched thin over his bones, but his eyes, those eyes, were filled with an unholy hunger. They gleamed with malice, with the same twisted longing that had been passed down through the generations. The curse had never been broken. It had only been passed down, from one generation to the next, like a dark inheritance that could never be escaped. "You think you can escape me?" The voice came from the man, but it wasn't his voice. It was the voice of the curse itself, deep and terrible, a voice that had existed long before him and would exist long after him. "You are mine. Your soul is mine. You belong to this house, to the darkness that lives within it." Lily's mind screamed for her to run, to fight, but her body refused to move. She was trapped. There was no way out. The curse had already claimed her, and now it was complete. "The cycle continues," the man whispered, his lips curling into a twisted grin. "You will never be free. None of you will." The shadows closed in, swallowing her whole, pulling her into the darkness. Lily could feel herself being dragged deeper into the house, deeper into its heart, into the very soul of the curse. The walls pressed in, suffocating her, the air thick with the stench of decay and despair. And as the shadows swallowed her whole, she realized the truth. There was no escape. The curse was eternal, and it would continue, passed down through each generation like a dark legacy. The house would always be waiting, its doors always open, its darkness always hungry. Lily was trapped, forever bound to the house, to the curse, to the man whose soul had never been freed. And as she faded into the darkness, her last thought was of her grandmother, trapped just as she had been, and now, so was she. The cycle had come full circle, and it would begin again. The house stood silent once more, its walls still and empty, save for the whispers that lingered in the air like ghosts of the past. The curse had claimed another soul. The cycle, which had begun long before Lily's time, would continue, forever unbroken. Outside, the night was calm. The wind stirred the leaves in the trees, and the distant hum of the world outside carried on, unaware of the darkness that still lingered within the house. Inside, however, the house remained alive. The shadows stretched, slithered, and waited. It had claimed another, just as it had done for generations, and now it would feed on her. The house was patient. It would wait for the next one, for the next soul to inherit the cursed ring, to fall into its trap, and to be pulled deeper into the darkness. For the curse never ended. It only moved from one generation to the next, always looking, always hungry. Name of the next story: The Silent Caller. The phone buzzed on the table, the sound sharp in the quiet of the night. A single notification. She stared at it for a moment, her finger hovering over the screen, hesitant. Emily had been home alone for the past few hours. The house was empty. The only sounds were the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards and the distant hum of the refrigerator. She had finished her work for the day, and now, in the stillness of the night, she had nothing to distract her. Unknown number, it read. She frowned. Another spam call, no doubt. She'd been getting them more and more lately. Random numbers, strange area codes. At first, it had annoyed her. Then it had just become something she ignored, something she blocked, hoping they'd stop. But now, with the phone buzzing in the quiet of the night, something felt different. She picked up the phone, unlocking it with a swipe of her finger, and opened the message. Her eyes skimmed the text, and her breath caught in her throat. "You will spill coffee on your shirt at 8:47 a.m. tomorrow." Emily blinked, staring at the words. She hadn't read anything like it before. The message was oddly specific, unnervingly so. Her first instinct was to delete it, chalk it up to some kind of weird prank, maybe an app glitch. But there was a strange pull to it, a feeling that wouldn't let her go. She glanced at the time, 11:15 p.m. The message had been sent just a few minutes ago. What was this? How did someone know what she was going to do tomorrow morning? Her fingers hovered over the delete button, but something stopped her. It wasn't just the message itself, it was the timing. A strange unease crawled up her spine. Just ignore it. It's nothing, she thought, her rational mind trying to calm her. It's probably just some stupid app. But before she could delete the message, her phone buzzed again. A second notification. "You will spill coffee on your shirt at 8:47 a.m. tomorrow, and someone will notice." Her fingers froze. The same message, word for word, except for the last part. Someone will notice. Emily's heart began to race. How could this person know that? She never spilled coffee on herself. Sure, she was clumsy at times, but this was far too specific. Far too creepy. The phone buzzed again. A third message, sent just moments after the second. "Your coworker Lisa will offer you a napkin. She'll smile when she does." Her eyes went wide. Lisa was her coworker, her closest friend at the office. Emily's hand trembled as she typed a quick reply, her mind scrambling for answers. "Who is this?" she typed. The response was almost immediate. "You'll find out tomorrow." The hair on the back of her neck stood up. This wasn't just some prank. It couldn't be. This was something else, something personal. Someone was watching her, someone who knew her routine, her co-workers, everything about her. What the hell is going on? She thought, but before she could reply, a new message popped up. "At 8:47 a.m. tomorrow, you will spill your coffee. It will be a sign." A sign. Emily felt a chill spread through her, a cold sweat gathering on her skin. She didn't know what this person wanted, but she was certain of one thing. This wasn't normal. There was something wrong with it, something deeply unsettling. She couldn't sleep that night. Her thoughts kept racing, replaying the messages over and over in her head. What did it mean? Who was this person? Why were they doing this to her? Morning came, and Emily barely slept a wink. Her alarm went off at 7 a.m., dragging her out of a restless slumber. She threw off the covers and dragged herself to the bathroom. Her face was pale, her eyes red from lack of sleep. She splashed water on her face, trying to wake up, but the events from last night kept replaying in her mind. She tried to push it out of her head as she prepared for the day. She dressed quickly, choosing a black blouse and dark jeans, hoping it would be a normal, uneventful day. But the unease lingered. She glanced at her phone, expecting the usual flood of messages, but there was nothing. No new notifications. Emily let out a breath of relief. Maybe it was over. Maybe she was just being paranoid. As she stepped into the kitchen to make her coffee, she glanced at the clock. 8:45 a.m. 2 more minutes, she thought. It's just a coincidence. Nothing's going to happen. She made her coffee, her hands moving mechanically as she prepared her morning cup. The minutes seemed to drag on, the seconds ticking by with agonizing slowness. 8:46 a.m. She stood there for a moment, staring at her cup of coffee, suddenly very aware of the heat radiating from it. 1 more minute, she told herself, trying to shake off the feeling creeping up her spine. And then, just as the clock flipped to 8:47 a.m., Emily's hand jerked. The coffee splashed out of the cup, splattering onto her blouse. Her breath caught in her throat. No, she thought, her pulse quickening. The clock on the wall ticked away, its sound deafening in the silence. The message, it was right. It was exactly right. She had spilled coffee on her shirt. Just like the message said. Just like the voice in her head had warned her. She stared down at the stain on her blouse, her hands shaking as she reached for a napkin. She could hear the faint sound of footsteps outside the kitchen, and then the voice of Lisa, her co-worker, calling out to her from the living room. "Hey, Emily, do you need a napkin?" The words sent a chill down her spine. Lisa appeared in the doorway, smiling as usual, a napkin in her hand, just like the message had said. Emily's mouth went dry, her heart racing in her chest. Lisa smiled at her, holding out the napkin. "You always seem to spill coffee in the weirdest places. You okay?" Emily couldn't speak. She couldn't move. She just stared at the napkin, at Lisa, at the situation that felt too real, too scripted. It was like she was stuck in some nightmare where every detail had already been written, already been decided. And then, before Emily could process what was happening, the phone buzzed again. "This is just the beginning." The phone buzzed again. "You'll notice someone watching you today. Watch closely. They've been following you." She blinked, her hand trembling as she reached for the phone. She could feel the weight of the words pressing down on her chest, the panic building with every message. Who was following her? Who knew about her so intimately? And as she glanced up at Lisa, who was still holding out the napkin with that same smile, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Something had shifted, but she didn't know how or why or who. The phone buzzed once more. "They've been watching you for a while. They know your every move. And now it's time to play." Her eyes went wide. What the hell did that mean? The words from the screen blurred together as Emily tried to make sense of what was happening. She looked up at Lisa, but the smile on her friend's face had begun to feel different, distant, almost vacant. Lisa's eyes, once warm and kind, now seemed hollow, as if they were staring through her, not at her. "Emily?" Lisa said again, her voice soft, yet with an odd edge to it. "Are you all right? You're looking a little pale." Emily's hands shook as she took the napkin, not trusting her own voice to speak. Her heart raced, the pounding in her chest so loud it almost drowned out the silence that had settled between them. Lisa stepped forward, concern still plastered on her face. "Do you want me to get you some water?" Lisa asked, her tone strangely soothing, too soothing. Emily forced a smile, though it felt foreign on her face. She couldn't understand why Lisa was acting this way. The napkin felt cold in her hand, the fabric slipping between her fingers as she wiped at the coffee stain. The moment felt off. Everything felt off. Her phone buzzed again. "She's not your friend." Emily's breath hitched, her eyes widening. The words cut through the air like a blade, cold and final. She had to be imagining it, right? She had to be. "Emily? You're shaking. Are you sure you're okay?" Lisa repeated, stepping closer. Before Emily could respond, another message arrived. This one was different. Look at her eyes. Emily's gaze snapped to Lisa's face, the words on her phone ringing in her ears. Her heart skipped a beat as she studied Lisa's eyes. The pupils were too large, too dilated, and the whites of her eyes were tinged with red, as if something had twisted them from within. Emily froze. Something was wrong. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. Lisa's smile widened, and Emily's stomach turned. It wasn't a smile she recognized. It was a smile that felt predatory, empty, like it had no warmth or affection behind it. "You know," Lisa said softly, her voice now dripping with an almost unnatural sweetness, "you've been acting so strange lately. You're always looking at that phone, always so distant. You should really let go of all that stress. It's not good for you." Emily took a step back, her heart thumping violently in her chest. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew it wasn't right. "Let's get you away from that phone, okay?" Lisa continued, her voice far too calm now. "Come on, we can sit down." Take a deep breath. Just relax. But Emily didn't want to relax. She wanted answers. She wanted to know who was sending these messages and why they were connected to Lisa. The phone buzzed again, the notification lighting up the screen. Lisa doesn't know what she's doing. She's being controlled. Emily's pulse raced, her hands trembling. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to get out of the house, but her legs wouldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, trapped in this suffocating moment, as the strange presence in the room seemed to grow stronger. Lisa reached out, her hand like a snake ready to strike. "Come on, Emily. It'll be easier if you just let go." The phone buzzed again. "You have to leave now. She's not who she seems." The words felt like a slap to Emily's face, as if someone had just ripped away a veil, showing her the truth. Her breath caught in her throat, and with an instinct she couldn't explain, she bolted past Lisa, running toward the door. But as her hand grasped the doorknob, she stopped. The door was locked. She hadn't locked it. She spun around, eyes wild, searching the room. Lisa was standing there, not moving, just watching her. The smile had faded, replaced by something darker, something colder. And then the phone buzzed again. She's part of it now. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, the air around her thick with dread. What did that mean? What was happening to Lisa? To her? "Let me out!" Emily screamed, her voice breaking. She rushed to the windows, but they were locked too, sealed shut. No way out. No escape. Lisa took a step forward, her expression unreadable now. "You can't leave, Emily." "Not yet." She smiled again, but this time it was something darker, a smile that didn't belong to a human being. "I don't understand," Emily cried out, her hands slapping against the windows. "Who's doing this to me? Why?" The phone buzzed again, and Emily's eyes darted down to it. The message was short, simple, and horrifying. "They've been watching you." Emily's breath came in ragged gasps. Who? Who had been watching her? The words felt like they were closing in on her, suffocating her, like the walls themselves were pressing in. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. And then she saw it. In the reflection of the window, she saw someone, no, something, standing behind her. It was a shadow, a dark silhouette that seemed to blend with the dimness of the room. It had no face, no distinct features, just an outline, a presence that made her skin crawl. Her heart stopped. She turned around, but there was nothing there. No one. "It's just the fear," she tried to convince herself. Just the stress. But when she turned back to the window, the shadow was still there, waiting. The phone buzzed again, and Emily's hands shook violently as she grabbed it. The message on the screen was chilling. "You're never alone." She looked at Lisa one more time, trying to read her expression, trying to figure out what was real. But there was no clarity, only that deep, gnawing terror that filled the air, leaving her paralyzed in place. And then she heard it, the sound of a phone ringing. It was coming from somewhere in the room. Her phone was silent. It wasn't her phone. It wasn't her ringtone. The ringing continued, louder now, insistent. Emily's eyes darted around the room, and then she saw it, another phone, lying on the kitchen counter. A black, unmarked phone that shouldn't have been there. The ringing grew louder, faster, and Emily found herself walking toward it, her feet moving against her will, as if something were pulling her toward it, forcing her to answer. She reached out, trembling, and picked up the phone. A voice, cold and mechanical, echoed through the receiver. "Emily," it said, "you've been chosen." The words sent a shock through her body, as if the very air around her had turned to ice. "Chosen? Chosen for what?" The voice continued, its tone flat, emotionless. "We've been watching you. We know everything about you. Every move, every breath." Her stomach churned. She knew then that this wasn't just some prank or glitch. Whoever, or whatever, was behind this could see her, could hear her, could know everything about her. The voice continued, its next words sending a jolt of pure terror through her veins. "You'll never be free." Emily's blood ran cold. The words echoed in her mind, drowning out everything else. "You'll never be free." She dropped the phone, letting it fall to the floor with a soft thud, but it felt as if the sound reverberated through her entire body. Her vision blurred, her mind spinning with fear. She couldn't escape. There was no way out. No way to outrun whatever had been watching her, whatever was controlling Lisa, whatever had been sending the messages. Her breathing came in ragged gasps. She stumbled back, her back hitting the wall as she slid to the floor. Her hands gripped her knees as she tried to steady herself, trying to focus. The world around her felt like it was closing in. She could still hear the ringing from the mysterious phone on the counter, still feel the weight of the presence in the room. And then, through the haze of terror, she heard something else. A soft tapping sound. It was slow, rhythmic, like footsteps. But there was no one in the room. No one but Lisa, standing frozen in place, her eyes still distant and hollow. Emily looked up, her heart racing again, but the tapping continued. It was coming from the walls, from the floor, from everywhere. Her body trembled as she slowly stood, her legs unsteady beneath her. She looked around frantically, trying to find the source of the noise, but it was everywhere. The walls seemed to vibrate with it. The windows rattled with the sound. Her mind screamed for her to leave, but every part of her felt paralyzed, stuck in the nightmare that had become her life. The phone on the counter buzzed again. This time, Emily didn't wait. She rushed to the counter, grabbed the phone, and brought it to her ear, even as the tapping grew louder, faster, closer. "Hello," she whispered, her voice trembling. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence on the other end. And then a voice, low, distorted, like static, crackled through the receiver. It wasn't the cold, mechanical voice she'd heard earlier. It was something worse. "Emily," the voice said, dragging her name out with unnatural malice. "We know everything about you. We've been waiting." The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but an eerie, suffocating silence. The voice continued, this time softer, almost intimate. "You've been chosen for a reason. You were always meant to be part of this. You just didn't know it yet." Emily's blood ran cold. "Part of this? What did that mean?" "You've seen us, Emily. We've been watching you for months." The voice lowered, almost a whisper now. "And now it's time for you to join us." Before Emily could respond, the sound of a door creaking open echoed through the house. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but there was nothing. No one. The voice on the phone continued, its tone now almost mocking. "It's already too late, Emily. You're already part of it." Suddenly, the phone in her hand went dead. The line went silent, and the tapping started again, this time louder than ever, almost deafening. Emily's head snapped to the walls, her eyes wide with terror, her heartbeat thudding in her chest. She turned to Lisa, who was still standing in place, her eyes now completely black, devoid of any emotion. She was no longer the Lisa Emily knew. She was just a vessel, a puppet controlled by whatever dark force was behind this. Lisa's mouth twisted into a grin that stretched too wide, too far. It wasn't her smile anymore. It was something grotesque, inhuman. "You're ours now, Emily," Lisa said, her voice suddenly harsh and distorted. It was no longer her voice. It was something else, something far darker. "You've always been ours." Emily's legs shook as she backed away, stumbling across the floor. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. All she could hear was the tapping, the sound of the walls closing in, of the house itself shifting around her. And then it happened. The lights flickered once, twice, and then they went out entirely, plunging the room into darkness. Emily's pulse raced, her chest tightening as she struggled to control her panic. She fumbled for her phone in her pocket, praying it still had some battery left. When she finally found it and turned on the flashlight, the beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but shadows. But then she saw it. In the faint light, she could see shapes moving in the corners of the room, figures creeping out from the shadows. Their outlines were dark, indistinct, and yet they were there, watching her. Her heart hammered in her chest, and she staggered backward, tripping over the coffee table. She scrambled to her feet, shining the flashlight in every direction, but there was no escape. The figures were everywhere, circling her, closing in. Suddenly, the phone buzzed again, the screen flashing in her trembling hands. They're already here. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she turned toward the phone's screen. The message wasn't from the unknown number anymore. It was from someone or something else entirely. The message was short, chilling. "You will never leave." And then the figures in the room began to move. They weren't human, not anymore. Their bodies shifted in unnatural ways, their limbs bending and twisting at impossible angles. Their eyes were empty, black pits, staring into her soul. Emily turned and ran, bursting through the door and into the hallway. She didn't know where she was going, didn't care. She just had to get away. The house seemed to stretch on forever, the hallways twisting and warping as she ran, the figures following her every step, their footsteps echoing in her ears. She burst through the front door and into the night air, gasping for breath. The sky was overcast, dark clouds swirling overhead. She didn't stop. She ran, her legs aching, her heart pounding. But no matter how fast she ran, she couldn't escape the feeling that something was right behind her. The phone buzzed again. "You can't outrun what you are." Emily collapsed onto the grass, the weight of exhaustion pulling her down. She looked at the phone one last time. The screen lit up with another message. "You were always meant to be part of us. There's no escape." The darkness around her seemed to close in, and the figures from the house emerged from the shadows, surrounding her, their faces twisted in grotesque grins. Emily's eyes widened in terror as she realized the truth. There was no escape. There never had been. She had been chosen, and now she would join them. The world around her faded to black, and then there was nothing. Name of the next story: The Dream Door. Elliot had always been a man who lived for routine. His days were simple, predictable. Wake up, go to work, come home, eat, sleep. The quiet comfort of his life had never bothered him. In fact, it was something he valued. But that all changed when he started dreaming about the door. It began as just another odd, nonsensical dream, a blurry, unremarkable scene of him standing in a dimly lit room. In front of him was a door. It was wooden, old, with peeling paint, and a brass handle that looked out of place. He didn't know why, but something about that door pulled him in. Without thinking, he reached out and grasped the handle. The moment he opened it, he was transported, not to another room, not to another place, but to a life. His life, or at least a version of it. He stood in front of a house, but it wasn't his house. It was larger, more elegant, with a well-maintained garden and a view that stretched out to the horizon. Inside, everything was different too. The furniture was grander, the walls decorated with art that he would never have chosen. But it felt right, comfortable even. In this version of himself, he was living a life of success. His work was thriving, he had a loving partner, and everything seemed to be in perfect order. At first, Elliot didn't question it. Dreams were strange things, after all. He was used to them. But as he spent more time in this other life, something began to gnaw at him. A feeling of unease. A quiet voice in the back of his mind telling him that something wasn't quite right. He woke up the next morning, his mind foggy, but his body still heavy with the lingering sense of that dream. It felt vivid, almost real. He shook it off as just another random dream, nothing more than his brain processing the day's events. But when he went to sleep that night, the door was waiting for him again. This time it was different. The door appeared in his dream, but this time when he opened it, it wasn't the same house. It wasn't even close. This version of his life was far darker. The walls were cracked, the floor covered in dust. There were no grand paintings, no furniture, just a barren, empty space that echoed with a cold, uncomfortable silence. His reflection in the cracked mirror on the wall looked nothing like him. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, and his clothes were old and torn. Elliot was shaken. This was his life, but it wasn't. It was a twisted version of it, a version where everything had gone wrong, where failure had overtaken him, and the emptiness of loneliness consumed him. He woke up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. He tried to dismiss the dream, but the unsettling feeling lingered. It wasn't just a dream. It felt like a warning, or worse, like a glimpse into something he couldn't control. The next few nights, the door appeared again. Each time, it led him to a new version of his life. Sometimes the life was even worse, filled with loss and pain. Other times, it was only slightly altered, just enough to feel strange, unsettling. But it was the third night that really broke him. When he opened the door, he found himself standing in the middle of a dark, unfamiliar room. The air felt thick, suffocating. There was no sound, no movement, just an overwhelming silence that pressed in from all sides. He looked around, but there was nothing. No furniture, no windows, no way out. It wasn't until he heard the voice that he realized he wasn't alone. Elliot. His name was whispered from the shadows, soft, almost sweet. But there was an edge to it, a coldness that made his skin crawl. He turned, searching for the source of the voice, but saw nothing. "Who's there?" he called, his voice shaky. The voice responded, but this time it was different. It was closer, deeper, and filled with an eerie sense of knowing. "I am you, Elliot, the version of you you've been running from." The words hit him like a punch to the stomach. "I don't understand," Elliot whispered, his breath ragged. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you've been running from me your whole life, hiding behind your routine, your comfort, your perfect little life. But I've always been here waiting. And now I'm ready." Elliot backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The room seemed to close in on him, the darkness pressing against him like a physical weight. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't think. "Please," he gasped, his heart racing in his chest. "I don't want this. I don't want to be you." But the voice laughed, soft and low, as though it was savoring his fear. "You don't have a choice, Elliot. You never did. I am you, and I'm coming for you." The door slammed shut behind him. He was plunged into darkness, and the world around him began to spin. He couldn't remember how he got back to his bed, but when he woke, his entire body was drenched in sweat. The images of the dark version of himself were burned into his mind. The next day, he tried to convince himself it was just a dream, a figment of his imagination. But the unease that had started to settle in his gut was now something darker, more real. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, he didn't go to sleep right away. He stayed awake, pacing around his apartment, trying to keep his mind occupied. He couldn't risk going back to sleep. He couldn't face whatever that voice had meant. But as the night wore on, exhaustion began to take hold of him. His eyelids grew heavy, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't keep himself awake. He drifted off, only to find himself standing in front of the door again. This time, he didn't open it right away. Instead, he just stood there, staring at it, knowing that whatever was on the other side would be worse than before. But the door beckoned him, calling him like a siren song. He had to know. He had to face it. Slowly, his hand reached for the handle. The moment he touched it, a chill ran down his spine. The door swung open, and he stepped through. This time, he was in a different place, a version of his apartment, but twisted. The walls were stained, the furniture overturned. It was a mess, but the worst part, there was someone else in the room. It was him. The version of him standing in front of him was not the same man he had seen before. This one was older, with sharp eyes and a cruel smile. He was wearing the same clothes Elliot had worn earlier, but they looked wrong, too tight, too worn. Elliot's heart skipped a beat. The man in front of him was no longer a version of himself. He was something else, something dangerous. "Who are you?" Elliot demanded, his voice trembling. The man didn't answer. Instead, he smiled wider, the grin stretching unnaturally. His voice echoed in Elliot's head, a whisper that chilled him to the bone. "I'm you, Elliot. The real you." And just like that, everything went black. When Elliot woke up, he was back in his bed, but something was wrong. His apartment felt off, like the world had shifted ever so slightly. And then it hit him. He wasn't alone. There, standing in the doorway, was the dark version of himself. And he was smiling. Elliot's blood ran cold. The figure in the doorway, his twisted reflection, stood there just watching him with that cruel, knowing smile. The man's eyes glinted in the dim light, as if he knew everything about Elliot, every secret, every weakness. For a moment, Elliot's mind went blank. He tried to move, to speak, but his body wouldn't cooperate. His legs were frozen in place, as though the very air around him had thickened into something solid. The figure took a step forward, and Elliot's heart skipped a beat. "Do you see now?" The man's voice was low, calm, but it sent waves of panic through Elliot's chest. "I've always been here, watching, waiting. Every version of you I've shown you, they were just glimpses. Glimpses of what you really are." Elliot couldn't understand. His breath came in short gasps as he struggled to break free from the invisible chains holding him in place. "No, this can't be real," Elliot stammered, his voice shaking. "You're just a dream. You're not real." The figure laughed, a sound so devoid of humor it felt like a physical blow. It echoed through Elliot's skull, reverberating off the walls. "Oh, I'm very real, Elliot. And you're about to find out just how real I am." With that, the man took another step toward him, and Elliot's mind exploded with a sudden, horrifying realization. He wasn't just seeing these twisted versions of himself in dreams. They were becoming real. They were crossing over, moving from the realm of sleep into the waking world. Panic surged through him, the realization that his life was slipping through his fingers, that something darker was invading his reality. He stumbled backward, his hands reaching for anything to steady himself, but there was nothing, no wall, no furniture, just the unyielding presence of the man in front of him. "You can't run from this," the figure said, his smile growing wider, more sinister. "You never could." The air around Elliot thickened, making it hard to breathe. He could feel the temperature drop, the room growing colder, darker. Shadows seemed to creep along the walls like living things, stretching toward him, clawing at his skin. The man stepped forward again, and this time, Elliot's legs gave way beneath him. He collapsed to the floor, his breath shallow, his body trembling with terror. "No!" Elliot gasped, trying to crawl away, but the man in front of him was faster. His hand shot out and grabbed Elliot's arm, yanking him back with terrifying strength. "You can't escape me," the man whispered in his ear, his voice like ice scraping against stone. "I am you, and you are me." The grip on Elliot's arm tightened, sending a jolt of pain through his body. His mind raced, searching for any way out, any escape, but nothing came. The door, his dream door, had been real. And now it was too late. "I don't want this," Elliot cried, his voice cracking with desperation. "I don't want to be like you." The figure chuckled, low and menacing. "It's too late for that, Elliot. You're already me. We're the same. Always have been." The world around Elliot seemed to blur, like his vision was swimming in thick fog. The room began to twist and distort, the walls stretching and bending like something alive. His heartbeat thudded in his ears, drowning out everything else. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the pressure lifted. The figure released his arm. Elliot gasped for breath, his body racked with fear and confusion. He blinked, trying to focus, but everything was wrong. The world felt off. He was no longer in his apartment. The walls had vanished, replaced by an endless void of swirling darkness. The only light came from the eerie glow of the figure standing before him. "Where am I?" Elliot whispered, his voice barely audible in the oppressive silence. "You're where you've always been, Elliot," the figure said, his tone almost gentle now. "You're inside your mind, and it's just as broken as I am." Elliot's heart hammered in his chest. He tried to speak, to beg, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. It was like his body had betrayed him, his throat too tight to form any sound. The darkness around him pressed in, suffocating him, and the only thing he could do was stare at the man before him, the dark reflection of himself. But the figure was smiling again, that same cruel, twisted grin. You never understood, did you? You thought you could control your life. You thought you could lock away the parts of you that scared you, that made you feel weak. But you can't hide from yourself forever. No, I didn't mean to, Elliot mumbled, his voice shaky. I didn't mean to be like this. The figure's smile faltered, but only for a moment. It's not about what you meant, Elliot. It's about who you are, and who you've always been. You're afraid of yourself, afraid of what's inside you, and now it's coming to claim you. Elliot felt his pulse race. The world around him began to tilt, like he was standing on the edge of a cliff. He could hear the figure's voice echoing in his mind, louder and louder, until it drowned out everything else. You'll never be free, the figure whispered, his voice wrapping around Elliot's thoughts like a vice. You're trapped here, forever. The ground beneath Elliot's feet crumbled away, and before he could scream, before he could even react, he was falling into the darkness, down, until there was nothing but blackness. And then nothing. When Elliot woke up, he wasn't in his bed. He was standing in a small, dimly lit room. The air was thick and stale, and there was no sign of the twisted version of himself. But something was wrong. The walls were covered in strange symbols, drawn hastily, as if someone had been desperate. The floor beneath him creaked with every step, and the air had a cold, metallic taste to it. As he looked around, trying to make sense of his surroundings, he saw a door in the corner of the room. It was a simple wooden door, but there was something off about it, just like the one from his dreams. Elliot's breath hitched in his throat. He knew he had to leave, to get away from whatever was happening, but his legs felt heavy, like they were weighed down by something. His thoughts were scattered, his mind trying to piece together what was real and what wasn't. And then the door creaked open. It was him. The dark version of Elliot stepped through the door, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light, his smile wide and knowing. I told you, he said softly. You can't run from yourself, Elliot. And with that, he stepped forward, and the door behind him slammed shut. Elliot stood frozen in place, his heart pounding in his chest. The dark figure, his twisted reflection, stepped into the room with slow, deliberate movements, the faint light casting eerie shadows across his face. His eyes never left Elliot's, and that smile, it was always the same, too wide, too knowing, and filled with something dark, something cold. Elliot took a step back, his legs shaky, his hands trembling at his sides. He wanted to scream, to shout for help, but there was no one. The room, the door, the man, everything felt like a nightmare, something that shouldn't exist outside his mind. But it was real. It was real in a way that made every inch of his skin crawl. What do you want from me? Elliot finally managed to choke out, his voice hoarse, cracking from the terror flooding his veins. The figure's smile only grew impossibly wide as he took another step forward. The air seemed to thicken around Elliot, suffocating him. I'm you, the man whispered, his voice echoing like a distant memory. And you are me. We're the same, Elliot. You're just too afraid to admit it. I don't, Elliot gasped, but the words stuck in his throat. He couldn't breathe properly, couldn't think straight. The walls felt like they were closing in, and the room was spinning. The man's words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. No. Elliot shook his head, as if trying to shake off the horrible truth he didn't want to face. This isn't real. This is just a dream. It has to be. The figure tilted his head slightly, studying Elliot with an unsettling calmness. You're still in denial, he said softly, almost pityingly. But I can help you. I can show you everything. All the pieces of you you've tried to hide. All the things you're afraid to face. Elliot recoiled, stepping back further into the corner of the room. His mind screamed at him to wake up, to escape, but no matter how hard he tried, it was impossible. The door was still there, but it felt just as unreachable as everything else. He was trapped in his own nightmare, a nightmare that had taken on a life of its own. "You think I'm just a figment of your imagination?" the figure asked, a dark amusement in his voice. "You think you can escape me by denying me? You've always been afraid of the truth, Elliot. The truth about who you really are. And now, you'll have to face it." "No, I can't," Elliot shouted, his breath coming faster, his pulse racing. "I'm not you. I'm not like you." The figure's smile never wavered, but his eyes darkened, and for the first time, there was a flash of something cold, something ancient in them. "You're not so different," he whispered, his voice laced with venom. "You've always been like me. It's just that you've been running from it, running from what's inside you. But you can't hide from yourself anymore, Elliot. I'm here, and I'm going to make sure you finally see it." Suddenly, the room around Elliot began to shift. The walls warped, the ceiling seemed to rise higher, and the floor beneath him cracked open. He stumbled back, feeling the ground tremble beneath him. He looked around, panic surging through him as the dream began to unravel even further. "You can't escape," the figure repeated, his voice low and steady. "Not from me. Not from what's inside you." The floor continued to crack, the darkness leaking through the gaps, swallowing the room whole. Elliot's vision blurred, the walls stretching outward as though the very space was bending to the figure's will. He felt a tug, an unseen force pulling at him, dragging him toward the center of the room. "No, no, no," Elliot cried, but his voice was drowned out by the rumbling of the ground beneath him. "This isn't real. This isn't happening." But the figure stepped closer, his footsteps slow and deliberate, as if he had all the time in the world. "It's already happened, Elliot. You're already here. In the darkness. In the truth." Elliot's mind was racing, trying to piece together something, anything, that could save him. The man in front of him wasn't just some figment of his dreams. He wasn't just an imaginary monster. He was something real, something born of Elliot's own deepest fears, the parts of himself he had buried for so long. "No! Stop!" Elliot shouted, desperate, his hands reaching out to the figure as though he could push him away. But the figure didn't flinch. Instead, he simply grabbed Elliot's wrist with terrifying strength, yanking him forward. "You can't stop this, Elliot," the figure said softly, his grip tightening. "You've been running from me for too long. And now it's time to face what you've been hiding from." The world around Elliot cracked open completely. There was a flash of light, and then, for a moment, everything went black. When Elliot opened his eyes again, he wasn't in the room anymore. The darkness was gone, replaced by a familiar, but equally unsettling sight. He was standing in the middle of a street, the soft glow of streetlights casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. He could hear the distant hum of cars passing by, but there was something wrong, something out of place. His breath caught in his throat as he looked around. The world felt different, distorted. The edges of his vision seemed to flicker, like the entire scene was being played out on a broken screen. "Where am I?" he whispered, his voice trembling as he looked around. But as he turned, he saw something that made his blood run cold. There, in the distance, was the figure. Standing in the middle of the street, his back to Elliot. He was exactly the same, smiling, waiting, as if he had been expecting Elliot to show up. "No," Elliot breathed, shaking his head. "No, this isn't possible." But the figure slowly turned, and Elliot could see it clearly now. His own face, his own eyes staring back at him, dark and cold. The figure opened his mouth, his voice cutting through the silence. "It's too late, Elliot. There's nowhere left to hide. You're mine now." Elliot backed away, his legs weak, his mind screaming for an escape, but there was no escape. The figure was getting closer, his footsteps deliberate, unhurried. And Elliot knew deep down that no matter how much he tried to run, he would never be able to outrun himself. Elliot's heart raced as he stumbled backward, the weight of the figure's words crashing down on him like a tidal wave. His legs felt heavy, as if the very ground beneath him was pulling him deeper into some unseen pit. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused to move, frozen in place by the nightmare unfolding before him. "Stop," he pleaded, his voice weak and hoarse. "Please, just stop." But the figure didn't stop. It never did. His dark eyes gleamed with something that felt both ancient and knowing. The smile that twisted across his face was no longer playful or mocking. It was predatory, the kind of smile someone wears when they know they've won, when they know they've already claimed their prize. "I told you," the figure's voice echoed, the sound vibrating in the empty street. "You've been running from me for so long, Elliot, but you can't hide from yourself forever. I am you, and you are me." Elliot shook his head, his mind spiraling into chaos. "This isn't real," he told himself. "It can't be real." But the street around him felt too solid, too tangible. The sounds of traffic were too real, the faint smell of gasoline mixing with the night air. He could feel the pavement beneath his feet, rough and unyielding. This wasn't just a dream anymore. This was something else, something far worse. "I'm not you," Elliot whispered desperately, his voice barely audible. I'm not like you." The figure took another step forward, his movement so smooth, so effortless, it was as though he was gliding across the ground. His eyes never left Elliot's, and with each step he took, Elliot felt a new wave of dread wash over him. His pulse quickened, his chest tightened, his breath came in ragged gasps. "Do you really think you can outrun your past?" the figure asked, his voice dark and laced with a cruel amusement. "You've always tried to bury it, haven't you? Pretend it doesn't exist. But I am the truth, Elliot. The truth you've been running from." Elliot took a step back, his feet faltering. He could feel his mind slipping, the reality around him warping and twisting. Every time he tried to force his thoughts into focus, the edges blurred, like trying to hold on to a fleeting memory. He wanted to wake up. He wanted to escape. But this was no dream. He was trapped in this nightmare. Trapped with the darkest version of himself. "You're wrong," Elliot choked out, shaking his head violently. "I'm not like you. I never have been." The figure stopped in his tracks, his expression darkening, his eyes narrowing. "You are me, Elliot," he hissed. "And no matter how hard you try to fight it, you always will be." Without warning, the figure lunged forward, his hand shooting out to grab Elliot by the wrist. Elliot gasped, trying to pull away, but the grip was ironclad, unbreakable. The coldness of the figure's touch seeped through him, making his skin prickle with an overwhelming sense of wrongness. "You can't escape what's inside you," the figure said, his voice a low growl now, as if something far darker was rising to the surface. "It's already here, inside your soul. And now, I'm here to stay." Elliot's heart slammed against his chest, his mind screaming for him to break free, but his body refused to obey. The figure's hand tightened around his wrist, and Elliot could feel the pressure building, a sickening, crushing sensation that made his vision blur with pain. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. It was as if the figure was draining the very life from him. "No! Let me go!" Elliot cried out, his voice breaking with desperation. "Please!" But the figure didn't let go. His fingers dug deeper into Elliot's skin, and with each passing second, Elliot could feel something changing, something shifting deep within him, as if the figure's touch was leaving behind a piece of itself, a part of its darkness. "You think this is pain?" the figure whispered, his lips curling into a wicked smile. "This is nothing compared to what you've been running from. The real pain, Elliot, the one you've buried, is much worse." Elliot's breath came in frantic gasps, his chest tightening, his mind spinning with confusion. He didn't understand. What was this? What did the figure mean? And why did it feel like he was slipping into something he couldn't control? The figure's eyes gleamed with a knowing darkness, and for a moment, Elliot could have sworn he saw something else in those eyes. something far more terrifying than anything he'd ever imagined. It was a reflection of himself, twisted and broken, something that stared back at him with hatred and malice. And in that moment, Elliot realized the truth. The figure wasn't just a part of his mind or a manifestation of his fears. The figure was a manifestation of his darkness, the parts of himself that he had spent years burying, pretending didn't exist. It was everything he hated about himself, everything he wished he could erase. The selfishness, the anger, the guilt, the regret, the lies. The figure leaned closer, his cold breath brushing against Elliot's ear. "You've always known I was here," he whispered. "You just didn't want to face me." "No," Elliot gasped, shaking his head frantically. "No, this can't be real. You're not real." The figure chuckled softly, almost pityingly. "You've been lying to yourself, Elliot. You've been running from me for so long, but you can't outrun who you are. I am you, and I've always been here." Elliot's legs gave way beneath him. He collapsed to his knees, his mind spiraling into chaos as the truth came crashing down. He was no longer just fighting for his freedom. He was fighting for his very identity. And no matter how hard he struggled, it felt like the darkness was consuming him, slowly pulling him into a place he couldn't escape. The figure crouched down in front of him, their eyes locking once more. "You can't escape yourself, Elliot. You never could. And now you'll learn to accept me." With those words, everything around Elliot went dark once again. The street, the world, the figure, all of it faded into nothingness, leaving Elliot alone in the cold, empty void. And as the darkness consumed him, Elliot realized there was no waking up from this nightmare. There was no escape from the door he had opened. There was no escaping the darkness within himself. He was lost. Elliot's eyes fluttered open, his vision hazy as he blinked against the blinding light. He wasn't sure where he was anymore. The streets, the figure, the crushing weight of it all. Had it been real? Had it been a dream? He tried to sit up, but his body felt heavy, sluggish, as if he'd been asleep for days. His pulse pounded in his ears, a sharp, steady rhythm that only intensified the disorientation. It was then he realized something was wrong. His surroundings were familiar, but they weren't right. The room he found himself in was dimly lit, a cold, sterile white light overhead casting long shadows on the floor. The walls were bare, smooth concrete, and the air smelled sterile, like a hospital. The only furniture was a single metal chair, bolted to the ground. Elliot's heart skipped a beat as he slowly stood up, his legs unsteady beneath him. He staggered to the nearest wall, feeling his pulse quicken as he scanned the room. "Where am I?" he thought. "Why can't I remember how I got here?" As he moved to the door, he noticed something strange, a small black rectangle on the floor, just beneath the edge of the door frame. The faint light from above reflected off its smooth surface, and Elliot couldn't help but feel drawn to it. He knelt down, his hands trembling as he picked it up. It was his phone. His throat tightened as he held it in his hands, the weight of it feeling almost too heavy. The last time he remembered having it, he had been running. From the figure. From whatever that dark version of himself had been. He had been trying to escape. But there was no escaping the truth. No escaping him. With a deep breath, Elliot unlocked his phone. The screen lit up, and his eyes widened as he saw the flood of messages waiting for him. Hundreds of them. His thumb hovered over the screen, but he didn't want to see who they were from. He didn't need to look. He already knew. The silent caller. The same messages that had haunted him for weeks. The ones that predicted his every move. The ones that had led him down this twisted path. His hands were shaking as he opened the first message. "You can't outrun the truth, Elliot." His stomach churned. The voice from his dreams, the one that had been there all along, it was the same. The words sent a cold shiver down his spine. He closed his eyes, trying to block it out, but the words echoed in his mind, vibrating through his skull. "I am you." Elliot swiped to the next message. This one was from an hour ago. "You're closer now. You can feel it, can't you?" The door is waiting. It always has been. His breath caught in his throat. The door from his dreams. It had always been there, lurking at the edge of his mind, beckoning him. It was never just a dream. It was a door that led to something deeper, something darker. The messages continued to flood his phone. Some were cryptic, others direct. Each one seemed to pinpoint his every fear, his every doubt. You've seen the truth, Elliot. You've opened the door. Now you must face what's on the other side. The screen flickered, the message blurring for a moment before the words became clear again. But this time, the message wasn't from the silent caller. It was from himself. You think you can run, but there's nowhere left to hide. I'm coming. Elliot's breath hitched, his chest tightening with panic. He knew. He knew what this meant. It wasn't just a message. It was a warning. A warning that the dark version of himself, the version that had been waiting for him in his dreams, was closer than ever. He had crossed the threshold, and now the door had opened wide. He stood up, his legs feeling weak beneath him. The room seemed to shrink as his mind spiraled. Where do I go? What do I do? Elliot's eyes darted to the door. It was the only way out, but he could feel something pulling at him, something urging him to stay. The figure had told him he couldn't escape himself, but he had to try. He had to. Taking a deep, unsteady breath, he reached for the door handle. The metal was cool against his skin, but as soon as he gripped it, the world around him seemed to shift. The floor beneath him tilted, the walls closing in, and for a moment he felt like he was falling. The door swung open with a loud creak, and Elliot stumbled into the hallway beyond. His heart was pounding so loudly in his ears that he could barely hear the echo of his footsteps. The corridor stretched out in front of him, dimly lit and endless. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the building itself was alive, watching him. Every shadow in the corner seemed to move. Every flicker of light felt like an omen. He wasn't alone. The door slammed shut behind him, and Elliot froze. His heart skipped a beat as he heard a voice, his voice, whispering through the walls. It was low, distorted, as if it was coming from all directions at once. I'm right behind you, Elliot. He whipped around, his breath catching in his throat, but there was nothing there. Nothing except the dark, uninviting hallway stretching into the distance. You can't run anymore. The voice was clearer now, and Elliot knew. He knew what was happening. The dark version of himself wasn't just in his dreams anymore. It was here, in the real world. He took a hesitant step forward, the air feeling heavier with each passing second. His mind raced. He had to find a way out. He had to stop this. But no matter where he turned, no matter which door he tried, it felt like the walls were closing in on him. Every hallway, every room seemed like a trap. His phone buzzed again, its light flashing in his pocket. He pulled it out, his hands trembling as he unlocked it. The message that appeared on the screen was simple, but the terror it instilled was undeniable. You're still running. Elliot's fingers shook as he typed a message in response. His hands were slick with sweat, his mind spinning. He had to face it. He couldn't keep running from it anymore. What do you want from me? The reply came almost instantly, but this time it was different. The response wasn't from the silent caller. It wasn't from his dark self either. It was from someone he thought he'd never hear from again. You opened the door, Elliot. Now you have to live with the consequences. Elliot's heart stopped. That voice. It was his mother's voice. But she had died years ago. His blood ran cold as the truth hit him harder than anything before. This wasn't just a nightmare. This wasn't just some twisted game. This was something far worse. Something that had been waiting for him, biding its time. And now he had no escape. The walls began to close in on him again, and he could feel his pulse thumping in his ears. The door had opened, and now the darkness was swallowing him whole. I'm here, Elliot. And he realized he wasn't just being hunted. He was already lost. Elliot's pulse thudded in his throat as the walls around him seemed to press inward. a suffocating pressure building with every breath he took. His legs wobbled beneath him, as though the ground itself was shifting underfoot. The hallway stretched endlessly in front of him, the same dim, unfeeling light flickering overhead, casting sharp, jagged shadows on the walls. The air felt thick, heavy with something dark and malevolent that made his skin crawl. The phone buzzed again, snapping him out of his spiraling thoughts. He fumbled for it in his pocket, almost too afraid to look at the screen. What if it was the voice again, the one that had been haunting him, pulling him deeper into this nightmare? But he had no choice. He had to see it. He had to know. His hands shook as he unlocked the phone. The screen lit up, and there it was, another message, this one just as chilling as the last. "I told you, Elliot. You can't outrun what you've become." His stomach turned. What had he become? The thought sent a cold wave of dread over him. The door. The versions of himself. The shadow that had been chasing him. Was it really just his mind breaking under pressure? Was he losing touch with reality? Or was there something more to this? Something darker? He looked up from his phone, his eyes scanning the endless corridor again. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. Something that wasn't human. He started to walk, his footsteps echoing eerily in the narrow hallway. Each step felt like a heavy burden, as if the weight of his fear was dragging him down, making every movement harder. He could feel the eyes on him. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, whispering to each other, watching him, closing in on him. As he turned a corner, the hallway stretched out even farther, like it was constantly shifting, never-ending. Panic rose in his chest. Where am I going? What is this place? The thought gnawed at him. His mind screamed at him to turn around, to go back, but the hallway seemed to twist and writhe like some grotesque maze, leading him deeper into its web. He stumbled on, feeling like the walls were closing in even more with each step. His breath came in shallow gasps, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt like he was losing his grip on reality, like he was slipping into something he couldn't understand. A deep, oppressive silence hung in the air, thick with tension, broken only by the sound of his ragged breathing. He turned another corner and froze. At the far end of the hallway, just before the dim light began to fade, he saw it. A door. It wasn't like the others. It wasn't part of the twisted maze he'd been walking through. This door, this one was different. It was dark, old, and weathered, the wood chipped and scarred. It looked out of place, like it didn't belong here, in this nightmarish version of reality. He felt drawn to it, an inexplicable pull, as though something beyond the door was waiting for him. Something he couldn't see, but could feel. Something that had been waiting for him all along. He approached it, each step feeling heavier than the last. His hand reached out for the doorknob, his fingers trembling with the fear of the unknown. He gripped it, and the door creaked open. The room inside was shrouded in darkness. It felt wrong. The air was colder, the silence even more oppressive. His heartbeat thundered in his ears as he stepped inside, the door slamming shut behind him with a force that sent a shockwave through his chest. The room seemed to close in on him, its darkness swallowing him whole. He could barely make out anything at first, but then his eyes began to adjust to the faint light seeping through cracks in the walls. And there, in the center of the room, was a figure. It was him, but it wasn't. The figure stood motionless, its back turned to him. The hair was the same dark color, the same tousled mess. The posture was the same, but something about it felt off. It felt wrong. This version of himself was different. There was a darkness to it, a coldness that sent a shiver down his spine. "Elliot," a voice whispered from the darkness. His breath caught in his throat. It was his voice, but it sounded hollow, distant, like it came from deep within the room. Like it was coming from everywhere. "Who are you?" Elliot choked out, his voice barely a whisper. The figure turned slowly, its face obscured by shadows. But then, as if it were peeling away the darkness, the figure's features were revealed. It was him, but older, darker, haggard. The eyes that looked back at him were empty, devoid of any warmth or humanity. They were cold, lifeless, as if the person standing before him wasn't really him at all. "You're not real," Elliot said, his voice shaking with fear. This isn't real." The figure's lips curled into a twisted smile. "Real?" it echoed, its voice dripping with mockery. "What is real, Elliot? Who are you really? Do you know?" Elliot backed away, his body trembling, but the figure followed him, its every movement slow and deliberate, as if savoring his fear. He couldn't tear his eyes away from it, this twisted version of himself. This thing that had taken on his shape, his face, his voice. It wasn't just a figment of his imagination anymore. It was something real, something dark, something that had crossed over into his world. "I don't understand," Elliot whispered, his breath ragged. "What do you want from me?" The figure took a step closer, its smile widening. "I am what you've been running from, Elliot," it said, its voice like ice. "I am the truth you've been avoiding, the truth you've buried deep inside, afraid to face. I am everything you've tried to hide from yourself." Elliot's head swam, his thoughts spinning wildly. What was it talking about? What truth? He hadn't done anything. He hadn't. "You've always known," the figure interrupted, its voice cold and final. "You've always known you weren't the person you thought you were. You've known it all along, but you kept running. And now here we are." Asterisk. The room around Elliot seemed to collapse in on itself, the walls tightening with every word, every movement of the figure. He could feel the suffocating pressure building, a force that pressed in on his chest, making it harder and harder to breathe. "You're me," Elliot gasped, his voice barely audible. "But how? How are you real?" The figure laughed, a low, hollow sound that echoed through the room. "I'm not just you, Elliot. I'm everything you could have been, everything you could still be, if you let go of the fear. If you stop running from the darkness inside of you." Elliot's knees buckled as the figure advanced, its cold, empty eyes locking onto his. "I'm the part of you that's been waiting to break free." Suddenly, Elliot understood. It wasn't just a nightmare. It wasn't just some twisted dream. It was real, and there was no way to escape. The darkness had already claimed him. The air grew heavier, the pressure around him intensifying. Elliot's chest tightened, and he gasped for air, his throat burning as though the very atmosphere was suffocating him. The figure, his twisted reflection, continued to move closer, each step deliberate, each movement calculated. It wasn't just standing there, it was waiting for him to accept it, to embrace it. The very thought of it made his skin crawl. I don't understand," Elliot whispered, his voice breaking. His knees felt weak, his legs shaking as if they would give way beneath him at any moment. He tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. The walls were closing in, pushing him closer to the figure, to the darkness that seemed to be swallowing the room. The figure smiled again, its lips curling into that grotesque grin. "You don't have to understand, Elliot. All you have to do is stop running." With a shuddering breath, Elliot forced himself to speak. "Stop running? I'm not running. I don't know what you want from me. This can't be real." "Oh, but it is," the figure said, its voice soft, almost soothing, like a whisper in his ear. "This is as real as the darkness inside of you, as real as the things you've buried, the things you've ignored. You can't hide from me any longer." Elliot felt his legs buckle beneath him, and he collapsed to the cold floor, his hands pressed against his temples, as if trying to force himself awake. But he couldn't. It was too real. The weight of it, the suffocating silence, the crushing pressure of the room, it was all too real. And the figure, it wasn't just an illusion anymore. It was him. It was something that had been born from the parts of himself he'd kept hidden. The anger, the regret, the fear. The figure knelt down in front of him, its cold eyes locked on his. "You've always known, Elliot. Deep down, you've always known what this is. You've known who I am." Elliot shook his head, tears blurring his vision. No, I don't." "You do. The figure interrupted, its tone sharp, cutting through the fog of his thoughts. You just refuse to admit it. You've seen me before in the dreams. You've heard my voice calling to you. I've always been here. And now, you're finally seeing me for what I truly am. Elliot's mind raced, his thoughts spiraling in every direction. The dreams, the door, the other versions of himself. He had been here before, hadn't he? But every time, he'd woken up, convinced it was just a nightmare, a hallucination. But now he was trapped. Trapped with this thing. This version of himself, twisted and contorted by everything he'd been too afraid to face. His breath hitched, and he found his voice, trembling as he spoke. You're not real. You can't be. The figure leaned in closer, its face only inches from his. I am real, Elliot. I am as real as you are. I'm the side of you that you refuse to acknowledge. The darkness you keep hidden. And now, it's time for you to see the truth. Elliot's eyes darted around the room, desperate for a way out. But the walls seemed to close in tighter, the light flickering as if the very fabric of reality was beginning to tear apart. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. All he could do was focus on the figure in front of him, this dark reflection of himself that seemed to grow with every passing moment. The figure stood up, its eyes never leaving Elliot. You've been running, Elliot. Running from the truth. Running from yourself. But there's nowhere left to run now. Elliot's mind raced. I can't stay here. I have to wake up. I have to escape. But even as he thought it, he knew it was useless. This wasn't just a dream. It couldn't be. What do you want from me? Elliot gasped, his voice raw with desperation. What do you want? The figure smiled again, but this time there was no humor in it. I want you to face it, Elliot. I want you to accept me, to accept what you've become. Because whether you like it or not, I am you. Elliot shook his head violently, his body trembling. No, I'm not like you. I don't want to be like you. The figure's smile faded, replaced by an expression of cold indifference. You are me, and you always will be. Without warning, the figure reached out and touched Elliot's chest, and a surge of cold electricity coursed through his body. Elliot gasped, his breath coming in ragged bursts as the room seemed to spin around him. The walls warped and twisted, the very air around him thickening, becoming suffocating, suffused with a dark, malevolent energy. He tried to pull away, but the figure's grip was like iron. It wasn't just holding him, it was draining him, feeding off his fear, off his denial. The darkness inside him was spilling out, flooding every inch of the room, consuming him whole. Let me go, Elliot shouted, panic rising in his chest. But the figure only smiled, the expression chillingly calm. No, it whispered, its voice like a death knell. You can't escape me. Elliot's vision blurred, his mind splintering under the pressure. He wanted to fight. He wanted to scream. But the darkness was overwhelming, the cold seeping deeper into his bones, suffocating him. He could feel himself slipping away, losing control. Then, just as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The figure was gone. The room, the hallway, the twisted darkness, it all vanished. Elliot blinked, disoriented, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He was standing in the middle of a familiar room now. The same room he had fallen asleep in. The same room he had always woken up in. But everything felt wrong. The silence was deafening, the stillness unnatural. His heart thudded in his chest as he looked around. Everything was exactly the same, yet it was different. Had he been awake this entire time? Or had the nightmare truly consumed him? His phone buzzed again. Elliot's hand trembled as he reached for it, the screen lighting up with another message. His stomach twisted as he read it. You didn't think it was over, did you? The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. His heart skipped a beat. The nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. Elliot's hand shook violently as he stared at the message on his phone. His breath caught in his throat, and he fought to steady his racing pulse. No, it couldn't be. This wasn't possible. The nightmare was over. He was awake now, wasn't he? But the message. You didn't think it was over, did you? He frantically swiped through his messages, his eyes darting over each notification, searching for any clue that would explain this. There was nothing, only that one cryptic message. Who could this be? He looked at the sender's name, unknown. Panic clawed at the edges of his mind. He tried to breathe, but the air in the room felt thick, suffocating. His eyes flicked around the room again, searching for anything out of place. Everything looked normal, too normal. But beneath the surface, something felt horribly wrong. Like the world had shifted, but only he could feel it. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to take slow, deliberate breaths. "It's just a prank," he muttered to himself, but even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. This wasn't just a prank. It couldn't be. Not after everything he'd seen in that place. The dark reflection of himself. The twisted version of his life. The thing that had followed him through his dreams. Suddenly, the phone buzzed again. "Unknown, I'm still here. You haven't gotten rid of me." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Elliot froze, his throat tightening. It wasn't just the words, it was the feeling behind them. The same oppressive feeling he had felt when he was in the dream world. The same suffocating weight. The same presence. It was here with him now, in the waking world. "No," he whispered. "This can't be happening." But the message kept coming. "Unknown, you'll never escape me. You'll never escape yourself." A chill ran down his spine, his skin prickling as a cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He knew what this was. It was that thing from his dreams, the reflection, the dark version of himself. It wasn't just a figment of his imagination. It had somehow crossed over. It was in his world now. The phone buzzed again, and his heart sank. "Unknown, you think you're awake, but you're not. You're still dreaming. And I'm waiting for you to open the door again." The words sent a shiver down his spine. The door in his dreams, the one that led him to different versions of his life. He hadn't thought about it since he woke up, but now the thought of it made his pulse race. The door is still out there. It's still waiting for you. Elliot's mind spun, his thoughts swirling in a haze of fear and confusion. He tried to steady himself, but the weight of everything was crushing him. Was he still dreaming? Was this all just another nightmare? But the messages felt too real, the sensation of being watched, of being hunted, too visceral. It was real. He was awake. And yet this wasn't normal. None of it was. He quickly stood up, pacing the room, unable to shake the sensation of being trapped. He had to do something. Anything. The reflection was still out there, still in the shadows, waiting for him to fall back into its grasp. His phone buzzed again, and Elliot nearly dropped it. His fingers trembled as he unlocked the screen. "Unknown, I see you." He felt his stomach lurch, while rising in his throat. "It sees me." The thought was terrifying. The feeling of being watched, of being known, in a way that went deeper than just physical sight. This thing knew him. It knew things about him that he hadn't even told himself. The reflection had been right. It had always been there, lurking beneath the surface. Now it was crossing into his world, pulling him back into the nightmare, piece by piece. And soon, it would be too late to escape. Elliot rushed to the window, throwing it open. The cool night air hit his face, the sound of the city outside grounding him for a moment. He looked out, trying to steady his breath. But the sense of unease didn't leave him. It had followed him here, and it would follow him wherever he went. The phone buzzed again, and Elliot's heart skipped a beat. "Unknown, you think you can run. But I'm already inside." The message froze him in place. His body tensed, his mind racing. Inside. What did it mean by that? Had it somehow entered his home? He turned quickly, scanning the room. His eyes darted over the furniture, the walls, the door. Everything was as it should be, and yet the air felt different. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper, more oppressive. The silence was thick, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Then, his eyes landed on the door to the hallway. It was slightly ajar, the gap barely wide enough for him to see into the dark corridor beyond. The shadows there seemed to move, to shift as if something was waiting, watching. His phone buzzed again, a single message flashing on the screen. Unknown, come find me. Elliot's pulse spiked. He couldn't go back there. He couldn't face it again. He didn't know what was real anymore, what was a dream and what was waking life. But deep down, he knew that if he didn't confront it, it would follow him forever. The door, the reflection, it was all tied together, and it was all coming for him. With his heart pounding in his chest, Elliot took a step toward the door. The shadows seemed to grow darker, colder, and the floor beneath him felt like it was shifting, like the ground was pulling him in. As he reached for the doorknob, he heard a soft, familiar voice, his own voice, whisper in his ear. Don't open it. You don't know what's waiting for you. But it was already too late. The door creaked open slowly, and as Elliot stepped into the dark hallway, the world seemed to twist around him. The very air itself seemed to pulse with something sinister, as if the house was alive, breathing with him, pulling him deeper into the nightmare. The walls seemed to stretch, and the lights flickered above him. And then in the distance he saw it. A door. The same door. The one he had seen in his dreams. It was standing at the end of the hallway, beckoning him. This time, there would be no waking up. Elliot's heart hammered in his chest as he moved forward, each step heavier than the last. The hallway stretched out before him, long and uninviting, the walls closing in around him as though the very space was constricting. His fingers brushed against the cold, damp wood of the doorframe as he walked, and he could feel the faint vibrations of something, someone, moving just out of sight. The door at the end of the hall loomed larger with each step, its outline fuzzy in the dim light. He could feel it calling to him, as though it was alive, a part of him, an extension of the very nightmare that had been stalking him. Every instinct screamed for him to turn back, to run, but he couldn't. Something pulled him forward, a force stronger than fear itself. You've come this far, he thought to himself, but even his inner voice sounded distant, uncertain. He had no choice but to continue. As he approached the door, the air grew colder, and the silence around him deepened, pressing in on his ears. There were no sounds of traffic from outside, no hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, just an unnerving stillness that made every movement feel like a betrayal to the unnatural quiet. He reached for the door handle, his hand shaking. The cold metal felt smooth against his palm, but as his fingers wrapped around it, a sensation of wrongness surged through him. Something about the door, about the feeling of it in his hand, felt too familiar. His mind screamed at him to stop, to not open it, but his body moved on its own accord. Slowly, he twisted the handle. The door creaked open, revealing the same dark void behind it, the same oppressive, suffocating blackness he had seen in his dreams. And there, standing in the middle of the room, was the reflection of himself. But this time it was different. It wasn't the version of himself he had seen the first time he had opened the door, the version that was distant, unreachable, and cold. No, this version was far darker. It was twisted, eyes hollow, skin unnaturally pale, and the smile it wore was twisted in a way that made Elliot's blood run cold. It was him, but not him, not the man he knew. You came back, the figure said, its voice a distorted echo of his own. Elliot's breath caught in his throat as he stepped back, almost tripping over his own feet. The figure in front of him mirrored his every movement, its smile never fading, the gleam in its eyes growing more intense. No, Elliot whispered, his voice cracking. You're not real. You're just a dream. The figure's grin stretched wider, as though it reveled in his fear. Am I? It asked, its voice dripping with mockery. Are you sure? Elliot tried to back away, but his legs felt heavy, his feet rooted to the spot as though the floor beneath him had suddenly become molten. His stomach twisted, nausea rising within him. His hand shook uncontrollably, and he reached for the door behind him, desperate to leave this nightmare. But when he turned, the door had vanished. The hallway was gone. The entire house had disappeared. He was trapped in that room, surrounded by the oppressive dark, with only his reflection, no, that thing, staring back at him. "It's your fault," the figure said, its voice slithering into his mind. "You brought me here. You opened the door again. Now, you'll never escape." Elliot gasped, his pulse quickening. The room began to shift, the walls warping around him, closing in. He could feel his breath becoming shallow as panic surged through him. He couldn't breathe. The air was thick, suffocating. He couldn't move. The reflection, the thing, was slowly advancing toward him, its movements slow but deliberate, as though it enjoyed the fear that emanated from him. The walls were pressing closer. The space around him seemed to be shrinking, the ceiling lowering, the ground buckling beneath him. And yet, he couldn't look away from the thing that was once him, the thing that had once been part of him. It was almost within reach now, just a few steps away. "No," Elliot gasped. "No, stop." The thing's smile grew impossibly wide. It spoke again, but this time, its voice was no longer just an echo of his own. It was something else, a guttural, unnatural sound that chilled him to his core. "You wanted to know if it was real. Now you know," it rasped. "It's always been real." And then, in a flash, it lunged at him. Elliot's body jerked awake, his eyes snapping open. His breath came in ragged gasps as he shot up from his bed, heart pounding in his chest. His skin was slick with cold sweat, and his hands trembled as they gripped the sheets, as though they were still part of the nightmare. He was in his apartment, the familiar, safe surroundings of his bedroom. The moonlight filtered through the window, casting pale beams across the floor. His breath was still unsteady, and for a moment, he just sat there, eyes wide, trying to piece together the dream, the feeling, the terror that had clung to him like a second skin. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, breaking the silence. His pulse spiked, but he forced himself to pick it up. His fingers were stiff as he unlocked the screen, and he couldn't help but feel the sense of dread creeping back into his chest. It was a message from unknown. "Unknown, I'm not done with you yet." The message sent a wave of cold over him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. His hand shook as he set the phone down, but even as he did, he knew it wasn't over. The nightmare hadn't ended. It had followed him into the waking world. And the worst part, it wasn't just in his dreams anymore. It was real. Elliot stared at the screen, his breath shallow, unable to tear his eyes away from the words that burned into his vision. "I'm not done with you yet." His heart hammered in his chest, each beat louder than the last. It felt as though the room had shrunk around him, as though every corner was pressing in. The phone buzzed again, and he jumped. Another message. "Unknown, you can't escape me." You opened the door. Elliot clenched his fists, fighting the overwhelming sense of panic threatening to take over. He had to think. This is just a coincidence, he told himself. It's just a freaky coincidence. But even as the words passed through his mind, he knew they weren't true. The message, the dream, the thing in the room, all of it had been too real. He could still feel its presence, lingering in the corners of his mind like a shadow he couldn't escape. His phone buzzed once more, a third message. "Unknown, I'm waiting. Come find me." Elliot's stomach twisted. The message was different now. It wasn't just cryptic, it was a command. Come find me. He didn't want to follow that instruction, didn't want to go near whatever force had been haunting him. But the pull of the words was undeniable. He felt it in the pit of his stomach, like a weight dragging him towards something. Something he didn't want to face, but knew he had to. He stood up, his legs unsteady, his mind spinning. His apartment felt so suffocatingly quiet now, like it was closing in on him. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, the stillness pressing down on him as if it were alive, breathing. Every step he took felt heavier, each movement more deliberate, as though he were being watched. He needed answers. He had to understand what was happening. Was it just the stress of work? Was he losing his mind? But deep down, he knew this wasn't normal. This was something else, something darker, more dangerous. The door to his bedroom creaked open with an unsettling slowness. Elliot froze, his heart stuttering in his chest. No one was there, but the door was open, as if inviting him to step into the unknown. His body screamed at him to stay, to lock the door and hide, but the pull, the insistent whisper in the back of his mind, urged him forward. He stepped out into the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The apartment felt strange, warped, as though the air itself was thick with an energy he couldn't comprehend. The walls seemed to close in, but he couldn't stop moving. He reached the living room, where the silence was deafening. The soft hum of his refrigerator and the occasional creak of the building were the only sounds. Yet they felt wrong, like distant whispers that held some deeper meaning. His phone buzzed again. Unknown. It's already started. His throat tightened. He couldn't ignore it any longer. Whatever this was, it was inescapable. "Come find me," the message had said. But how? Where? Elliot glanced around the room, his eyes darting over the familiar furniture. The couch, the bookshelf, the coffee table. Nothing looked out of place. Everything was exactly as it should be. Yet it all felt alien now, as though it were part of a dream he couldn't wake up from. Then he saw it. The door. It was there, standing at the far end of the room, just like it had been in his dream. The door that led nowhere. A doorway to the abyss. It had always been there, right behind the bookshelf, hidden in plain sight. His breath caught in his throat. It had been there when he first moved in. He remembered it now like a distant memory, tucked away in the back of his mind. He'd always thought it was a storage closet or a utility room, something normal. But now, in the grip of his terror, he knew better. The door wasn't meant to be opened. It had never been meant to be opened. That's where it had all started. Elliot's hands shook as he approached the door. He could hear his heartbeat in his ears, the sound of blood rushing through his body. He reached for the doorknob, his breath ragged. The cold metal of the handle felt so familiar, and yet wrong. With a trembling hand, he twisted it, and the door creaked open, revealing only darkness beyond. It was the same as before, the same thick, suffocating void that had greeted him in his dreams. But this time, something was different. He could feel it. The air was heavier, charged with a presence he couldn't see, but could definitely feel. Something was waiting for him. Something was on the other side of that door. Elliot stepped forward, his feet moving of their own accord, as though his body was no longer listening to his mind. He crossed the threshold into the darkness, and the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang, the sound echoing in his skull. The darkness seemed to close in around him, pressing in on all sides, and the air grew thick, almost suffocating. He couldn't breathe. It felt like something was watching him, waiting for him to make a move. And then in the distance he heard it, a whisper, a soft, raspy sound that seemed to come from all directions at once. "I told you I'd find you." The voice was his own, twisted, wrong, like a distorted version of him. A version that shouldn't exist. The voice came closer, and Elliot's heart pounded in his chest. "You thought you could run from me," the voice continued, its tone mocking. "You thought you could escape, but I'm inside you now. I always have been." Elliot stumbled backward, his body trembling with fear. His hands shook violently as he reached for his phone, desperate to find something, anything, to anchor him back to reality. But when he checked the screen, it was blank. The air grew colder, and he could see his breath misting in front of him. The darkness pressed in, suffocating, as the voice grew louder, more insistent. "You're not alone," the voice hissed, just behind him now. "I'm right here, Elliot, and I'm never leaving." Elliot spun around, but there was nothing there, nothing but the thick, impenetrable blackness. His pulse quickened as he fumbled for the door, but when he reached out to grab it, it was gone. He was trapped, and the thing, the reflection, was coming for him. Elliot's chest tightened. His vision swam in the suffocating darkness as he stumbled backward. his feet tangling in the void that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The familiar, cold sweat pooled on his skin, his thoughts a frenzied blur. "What's happening?" The mocking voice echoed through the air, louder now. "You thought you could escape me. You thought the door would save you." Elliot couldn't tell if the voice was his own or something else entirely. It sounded like his thoughts, yet twisted, corrupted. The air around him seemed to vibrate with an oppressive weight, as if the space itself was alive, watching him. He spun around, his eyes desperately searching the void for some sign of the door, but there was nothing. Nothing but an endless expanse of black. His breath hitched in his throat as panic surged. No, no, this can't be real. It's just a dream. It's just a nightmare. He clutched his phone tightly in his hand, as though the small device could protect him from whatever was lurking in the darkness. His fingers were slick with sweat as he desperately tapped the screen, hoping for any sign of life. But the phone remained dead. The screen was as black as the space around him. Suddenly, the voice rasped from behind him again. It was closer now, closer than ever before. "You opened the door, Elliot. You opened it for me." He froze, dread seizing his entire body. He spun around, his breath coming in shallow gasps. There was nothing, but then from the corner of his eye, something moved. Elliot's heart skipped a beat. He turned quickly, but all he saw was a fleeting shadow. A shape, just a flash of movement. It was there, but then it was gone, melting back into the endless black. His pulse thudded painfully in his ears. Was it real? Or was it just his mind playing tricks on him? He forced himself to breathe, trying to steady his nerves, but the sense of being watched intensified. His skin prickled, every hair standing on end as if some unseen presence was circling, waiting. "You opened the door, Elliot," the voice whispered again, this time just behind him. He felt the coldness of the breath against his neck, and he spun around, but, again, nothing. The darkness was relentless. Elliot's legs gave out beneath him. He collapsed to the ground, his knees hitting the cold floor with a hollow thud. His hand pressed against the ground as he tried to steady himself, but the world felt like it was slipping away, pulling him further into the abyss. "I've always been with you," the voice said, now oddly calm, as though it was speaking from deep inside his mind, feeding on his fear. "Every version of you, it's me. Every life you've lived. I've been there. I've watched." The words sent a chill through him, more chilling than the darkness that surrounded him. His thoughts raced. Every version of me? What does that mean? He was too terrified to ask, too scared to move. The darkness was suffocating now, pressing down on him from all sides, a heavy weight that made his lungs burn. His heart raced, erratic and panicked, and he could feel something, someone getting closer. The temperature dropped, and the breath he exhaled turned to ice in the air. He was sure he could feel a cold, unseen hand brush across the back of his neck. But when he jerked his head around, there was nothing. Nothing but the endless black. And then the shadows shifted. Elliot's eyes widened. At first, he thought it was just the darkness playing tricks on him. But no, it was real. Something was moving within it, something that didn't belong. The shape was vague at first, just a dark blur, but then it began to sharpen. A figure. A man. It stood at the edge of his vision, tall and thin, its outline jagged and distorted like a reflection in shattered glass. He couldn't look away. The figure moved closer, and with each step, Elliot's heart pounded harder. No, 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 his mind screamed. This can't be happening. It's not real. It's not real. But it was. The figure stepped forward, its movements jerky, as though it were a marionette pulled by invisible strings. And with each step it took, a horrible realization washed over Elliot. This wasn't just any figure. It was him. It looked like him, but wrong. The face was twisted, its features contorted into something grotesque and distorted. His eyes were hollow, black voids. His skin was ashen, drawn tight against the bones beneath. The version of himself that stepped from the shadows didn't just look like him. It was him. A dark reflection. "You open the door, Elliot," the figure rasped. The voice was identical to his own, but wrong. It was soaked in malice. "And now I'm here. Now I'm free." Elliot's breath caught in his throat. His body trembled uncontrollably, paralyzed by terror. His hands shook as he reached for his phone again, desperate for something, anything, that could pull him out of this nightmare. But the screen remained blank, lifeless. He glanced back up, and the figure was closer now, its movements jerky and unnatural, like it wasn't fully in the world. "You can't escape me, Elliot," it whispered. "You opened the door. And now there's no turning back." Elliot tried to scramble backward, but his legs wouldn't move. His feet were rooted to the floor, as though the very darkness had begun to claim him. The figure drew closer, its hollow eyes locked onto him, its lips curling into a grotesque smile. And then the shadow moved. It reached out, a hand, cold and dark, stretched toward him with unnerving speed. He screamed, but it was too late. The last thing he felt was a cold grip on his arm, dragging him into the shadows. Elliot's scream was swallowed by the dark, as if the very air around him had turned to stone. The grip on his arm tightened, pulling him forward with an unyielding force. His body fought against it, but every movement felt like it was being sucked into the blackness, as if the darkness itself had a hunger for him. His limbs became heavy, his breath shallow, as though he were sinking into the earth. The figure's smile widened, its face a twisted reflection of his own, and its cold fingers dug deeper into his skin. He could feel the void closing in around him, its weight pressing against his chest like 1,000 hands, suffocating him with every breath. The world spun in and out of focus. His mind screamed for escape, but it was useless. The door had opened, and there was no going back. "Stop." Elliot's voice was barely a whisper, lost in the overwhelming silence. He pulled harder, trying to break free, but the hand on his arm didn't loosen. The figure leaned closer, its breath cold against his face, its eyes gleaming with an unnatural hunger. "You opened the door," it said again, the voice dripping with malevolent glee. "You let me in, and now you'll be mine." With a sudden jerk, the figure yanked him forward. Elliot's feet left the ground, and for a moment there was only a void, nothing but a dark abyss where time and space had no meaning. It was as though he was falling, tumbling through endless darkness. But then abruptly everything stopped. He landed hard, his body slamming against something cold and unyielding. His breath exploded from his lungs as he struggled to regain his bearings. His heart pounded in his chest, his skin slick with sweat, and his thoughts scrambled to make sense of what had just happened. The world around him was different. Not the same empty blackness as before, but a room, dimly lit, but familiar in a way that made his stomach churn. He blinked rapidly, trying to focus. It was his bedroom, but it wasn't his bedroom. The bed was the same, the nightstand, the bookshelf, all familiar objects, but they were wrong. The room was darker than it should have been. The shadows were too deep, as though they were alive, shifting and moving. The edges of the room seemed to curl in on themselves, as if the walls were closing in. The air was thick, heavy, like something was pressing down on him from all sides. Elliot shot to his feet, his heart racing. The room was suffocating, but there was no escape. The door, the same one from the dream, stood in the far corner, its handle twisted and contorted, as though it were made of something unnatural. The door. He had to get out, but before he could move, a voice echoed from the shadows behind him. "You still think you can escape?" it whispered. The voice was eerily familiar, but it was not his own. It was the same voice, the one he had heard in the dream. The voice of the dark version of himself. Elliot turned around, his heart in his throat. Standing in the center of the room was another version of him. His own face, twisted and distorted, staring back with cold, hollow eyes. The figure was wearing the same clothes, the same expression, but everything about it was wrong. The skin was stretched thin over the bones, the lips curled into a sadistic grin. The eyes, those empty black eyes, drilled into him, cold and unfeeling. "You thought you could escape?" the figure said, its voice dripping with venom. "You've opened the door, Elliot, and now it's mine. You're mine." Elliot stumbled backward, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "What? What do you want from me?" His voice cracked, the fear rising in his chest like a suffocating fog. The dark version of him laughed, a low, mocking sound that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. "What do I want?" It stepped closer, its movements unnaturally smooth, as if gliding over the floor. "I want what you have. Your life. Your choices. Your mind. You've lived your life, Elliot, but I've been waiting. I've been watching." Elliot's knees buckled, and he fell to the floor, unable to look away. His heart hammered in his chest, each beat louder than the last. His hands trembled as he reached out for the door, but it was too far. The darkness between him and the exit seemed to stretch longer, thicker. The figure was closer now, its cold breath washing over him. "No," Elliot whispered, his voice hoarse. "You can't have me. I won't let you." His hands balled into fists, trying to push himself up. His head spun, the edges of his vision blurring as the room closed in on him. "This isn't real. It's just a dream. I can wake up." The figure laughed again, its grin widening impossibly. "You think you can wake up?" It reached out, its fingers brushing against Elliot's face. "This is real, Elliot. This is your reality now. There's no waking up. You open the door." With a flick of its wrist, the figure dragged him to his feet, its fingers digging into his skin, cold and sharp. Elliot's body went rigid with terror, his breath caught in his throat. He could feel the darkness pressing in, suffocating him. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, closing in with every breath he took. The figure leaned in close, its face just inches from his. "And I'm here to stay." Elliot tried to scream, but the air was thick in his lungs, and no sound came. He tried to fight, but his limbs were weak, numb. It felt as if his body was being dragged down, pulled by invisible hands, the weight of his own fears dragging him deeper into the abyss. The door. He had to get to the door. His legs moved sluggishly, and with every step, the darkness seemed to stretch and twist, the air growing heavier, colder. The door was right there, but it was moving away, always just out of reach. His chest ached, each breath a struggle as he fought against the crushing weight of the dark room. "You can't outrun me," the figure's voice echoed behind him, like a cold whisper, scraping at his sanity. "I'm already inside you, Elliot. I've always been here." Elliot's breath caught in his throat. The room was suffocating, the door forever just a few inches beyond his grasp. The darkness pressed in tighter, and the twisted version of himself was right behind him, its hollow eyes burning into his back. But as he reached for the door once more, something inside him snapped. Something deep, primal, and terrifying. The door was no longer just a door. It was his door, his only way out. With a final burst of strength, Elliot reached for the handle, his fingers trembling as they closed around it, and as the cold metal pressed against his palm, he pulled. The door swung open. As the door swung open, a blinding light poured through the crack, flooding the dark room. The light was warm and intense, unlike anything he had ever seen before. It burned his eyes, but it was also a promise, a beacon of escape. For a moment, everything was still, as if the universe held its breath. Then the figure behind him let out a screech, a sound so raw, so primal, that it seemed to tear through his very soul. "No," the dark version of himself howled. "You can't leave. This is your reality, Elliot. My reality." Elliot didn't turn around. He couldn't. He could feel the darkness closing in, but he pushed forward through the doorway. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, the room he had been trapped in vanished. The blinding light wrapped around him, and for a fleeting second, he thought he might be falling again, falling through endless space. But then, the light began to dim, and the world began to take shape. Elliot gasped as he found himself back in his apartment. His apartment, his real apartment. the one he had woken up in just a few hours ago. The furniture was the same. The walls, the carpet, the windows, all familiar. But there was something wrong. A sense of wrongness clung to everything, like dust on a forgotten shelf. He stood there, breathing heavily, trying to make sense of what had just happened. His heart pounded in his chest, and his hands trembled as he reached out to steady himself against the couch. He blinked rapidly, trying to ground himself in the reality he thought he knew. But the apartment fell off. The silence was heavier now, like the room itself was holding its breath, waiting. The air was thick, stagnant, suffocating. Then, his phone vibrated in his pocket. Elliot froze. He didn't want to look at it, but the buzzing seemed to demand his attention, growing louder with every passing second. Slowly, almost hesitantly, he pulled it out. His hands shook as he glanced at the screen. The number was unfamiliar, no name attached to it, just a string of digits that felt like they were mocking him. And beneath the number, there was a message. "I'm still here. You can't escape me, Elliot. You'll never escape." His breath caught in his throat. It was the same voice, the same words that had haunted him in the dream, the same message that had come before, warning him of the twisted version of himself. But how? How was it possible? He had left the dream, hadn't he? He opened the message, heart racing, hoping, praying that he was wrong, that it was just a glitch, a mistake, or some sick joke. But as he stared at the screen, the text changed, shifting into something darker, something far more terrifying. "I'm watching you, Elliot, and I'm closer than you think." A chill ran down his spine. He looked around the apartment again, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. But there was nothing, no one. The air felt cold against his skin, but it was no longer just the chill of the evening. It felt like something else, something malignant. The phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up with another message. "You think you've escaped, but you're still in my world. I am the door, Elliot, and I will never let you go." Elliot dropped the phone onto the couch, his hands shaking violently. His breath was shallow, panic creeping up his throat like a cold hand. He backed away from the couch, his heart thundering in his chest. The walls felt like they were closing in again, the room pressing in on him, suffocating him with every passing second. No, this couldn't be happening. He had made it out. He had walked through the door. He had. The door. His eyes snapped to the hallway. The door. The same door from his dreams. It was there. It stood at the end of the hallway, its frame barely visible in the dim light of the apartment. The door that had once been part of his nightmares was now a tangible reality. "No," Elliot whispered, his voice barely a breath. "It can't be." He stood there frozen as the door slowly creaked open, just a crack at first, then wider, until it was fully ajar. The shadows inside the room seemed to swirl and writhe, and from within a faint, haunting sound emerged, a slow, deliberate tapping. "Elliot," the voice whispered from the darkness. It was his voice, his own voice, but twisted and distorted. "You've opened the door, and now you'll never leave." The tapping grew louder, more insistent, like a heartbeat echoing through the walls. A shadow shifted inside the room, just out of view, but Elliot could feel it. The presence was there. He could sense it, like a weight on his chest. He stumbled back, his breath coming in frantic gasps. He turned to run, but the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, the door at the far end growing larger with every step he took. His heart raced, his feet moving faster, but it was no use. The door was getting closer, closer than ever before. And then, just as he reached for the exit, he heard it, the sound of footsteps. Not behind him, but ahead of him, the figure, the dark version of himself. It was there, standing at the end of the hallway, waiting for him. Its eyes glowed with that same unnatural light, its grin wider than before. The smile that haunted him in every dream, every nightmare, every waking moment. It was real now, real and right in front of him. Elliot froze, his heart hammering in his chest. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body wouldn't respond. The figure took a step forward, its eyes never leaving him. "You're mine, Elliot," it whispered. "You've always been mine." Elliot's legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed onto the floor. The darkness closed in. The room seemed to warp around him, the walls bending and distorting. The door that had once been his escape, was now a prison. And as the figure moved closer, its shadow swallowing him whole, he knew. There was no escaping this nightmare. The door had claimed him, and now it would never let him go. The room felt like it was closing in on him, the walls pulsing with the rhythm of his panicked heartbeat. The figure's presence pressed down on him like a vice, suffocating, inescapable. Elliot tried to move, to fight, but his limbs were frozen, heavy, as though the very air around him had turned to lead. The figure stepped closer, its footsteps slow and deliberate, the scraping sound of its boots dragging on the floor sending shivers through his spine. The eyes, those hollow, glowing eyes, locked onto his, and Elliot felt an icy wave of terror wash over him, paralyzing him further. "You thought you could escape me," the dark version of himself murmured, its voice echoing in the silence. "You thought you could outrun your past, your mistakes. But you can't outrun me, Elliot. I am you." Elliot's throat tightened, but no sound escaped. His mind raced, trying to comprehend what was happening. This wasn't just some nightmare. This wasn't just some trick of the subconscious. The door, the figure, it was all real. The dark version of himself had followed him from the dream, crossed over into the waking world. "I am you," the figure repeated, its voice growing louder, more insistent. "I am the version of you that you can't face, the part of you you've been running from your whole life. You thought you could hide in your little apartment, pretend it didn't exist. But I found you, Elliot. I found you, and now you can't escape." Elliot's mind spiraled into chaos. He had never believed in supernatural things, never believed that dreams could cross over into the real world. But as he stared into the eyes of this creature, this twisted reflection of himself, he could no longer deny it. This was real. This was happening. "You're not real," Elliot choked out, his voice barely a whisper, filled with disbelief. The figure laughed, a low, rumbling sound that filled the room and made the floor vibrate beneath him. "Not real," it taunted. "I am as real as you are, Elliot. As real as every regret, every fear, every dark thought you've buried deep inside. You can't hide from me. You can't escape me. I am a part of you, and now you will face me." The temperature in the room dropped, a cold so biting it made his skin crawl. Elliot's breath fogged in the air, his teeth chattering uncontrollably as he fought to move, to get away. But the figure was already standing above him, towering over him, its cold eyes filled with nothing but malice. "You will face me," the figure hissed. "You can't hide from yourself forever." Suddenly, Elliot felt a sharp pain in his chest, a cold, stabbing sensation that made him gasp for breath. He looked down, horrified, as he saw a dark, shadowy tendril of smoke spiraling out from his own body, twisting around his legs, his arms, his chest. It felt like it was pulling him in, binding him to the floor. "No!" Elliot shouted, his voice raw with fear. "Get away from me!" But the figure was unfazed. It stepped closer, its smile widening, as the tendrils of darkness wrapped around Elliot's limbs, tightening with each passing second. His muscles screamed in protest as he fought to break free, but the shadowy tendrils only tightened their grip, pulling him closer to the figure. "You're mine, Elliot. You've always been mine," the figure whispered again, its breath cold and foul against his face. The words seemed to sink deep into his mind, like an echo that resonated through his very soul. "You cannot outrun me. I am you." Elliot's mind reeled. The door, what had he done? How had this thing crossed over from his dreams? Was he dreaming still? Was any of this real? But even as he questioned himself, the cold tendrils continued to bind him, and the figure continued to loom over him, its gaze unyielding. Then the dark version of himself leaned down, its voice a rasping whisper. "I'm always with you, Elliot. I will always be with you. You can't escape me. Elliot's breath hitched in his throat. He realized with a terrible clarity that this thing, this dark reflection of himself, had been a part of him all along. It had always been there, lurking in the back of his mind, waiting for the moment when his fears and regrets would finally catch up to him. It was more than just a nightmare. It was the embodiment of everything he had tried to bury, everything he had refused to confront. And now it was here. The figure straightened up, towering over him. "You can't escape your own darkness, Elliot. I am you. You are me. And now, we will be together." The room grew colder still, and the shadows seemed to deepen, swallowing everything in sight. The air felt thick, as if the very space was alive, suffocating him with its presence. But then, just as Elliot thought he couldn't take it any longer, something shifted. The door began to flicker, its edges glowing with an otherworldly light. For a moment, the figure hesitated, its eyes darting toward the door. It growled low in its throat, a sound that vibrated the walls. "No," the figure hissed. "No, you can't leave me. You can't escape." But Elliot didn't hesitate. He had to move. He couldn't stay here, trapped in this nightmare, chained to this dark version of himself. With a strength he didn't know he had, Elliot broke free from the tendrils, stumbling to his feet. His heart raced, adrenaline pumping through his veins as he bolted toward the door. The figure screamed behind him, its voice filled with fury and despair, but Elliot didn't look back. He couldn't. He needed to get out. He needed to escape. His hand reached the door, and just as the figure's scream echoed in the distance, Elliot wrenched the door open, stepping through it, out of the nightmare, and back into the unknown. As Elliot stumbled through the door, a wave of dizziness washed over him, making his head spin. He felt a rush of cold air, as though he was being pulled through a dark tunnel, and the world around him seemed to blur and distort. When his feet finally touched solid ground again, he was no longer in his apartment. He blinked, disoriented, trying to make sense of his surroundings. The room was dark, but not in the way it had been in his apartment. The air was thick, stagnant, almost suffocating. The walls were covered in strange symbols, their shapes twisting and shifting in the dim light. The floor beneath his feet was rough and uneven, made of jagged stone. He could hear the faint sound of whispers, low and unintelligible, echoing around him. Elliot's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. This was not the world he knew. This place was wrong. It felt like he had stepped into a different dimension, one that was twisted, broken. A nightmare made real. "What is this place?" Elliot whispered, his voice trembling. He turned around, but there was no sign of the door he had just passed through. It had vanished, leaving nothing behind but the oppressive darkness. His pulse raced, and for a moment, he thought he could hear the faintest sound of footsteps. Slowly, he turned in place, searching for the source of the noise. But there was nothing. No figure. No movement. Only the oppressive silence that followed him wherever he went. He took a step forward, his legs shaky as he tried to make sense of what was happening. His mind was reeling, trying to piece together what had just occurred. He had escaped, hadn't he? He had made it through the door, out of that nightmarish version of his apartment. But now, he wasn't sure where he was, or what he was facing. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, and he froze. They seemed to be coming from every direction, swirling around him like a thick fog. He could barely make out the words, but they were unmistakable. They were calling his name. Elliot. He spun around, heart pounding in his ears, but again, there was no one. The room was empty. The whispers were all around him, but they weren't coming from any single direction. They were in his head. Elliot. His stomach churned, nausea rising in his throat. He had to get out. He had to find a way back. But the longer he stood there, the more the room seemed to close in on him. The walls shifted, changing shape like liquid, undulating as though alive. The floor creaked beneath his feet, groaning under an unseen weight. It felt like the whole place was breathing. He stumbled backward, panic creeping into his chest as his mind spun wildly. This wasn't just a dream. He could feel it. This was something far worse. This was a nightmare that had come alive, a nightmare that he could not escape. And then he heard it, a sound sharp and distinct, cutting through the whispers. A voice. "You think you can escape me, Elliot?" The voice was low, guttural, but somehow familiar. It made his blood run cold. "No," Elliot whispered, his mind racing. "No, please, not again." A figure stepped out of the darkness, its form twisting in and out of focus. For a moment, Elliot thought he was imagining things, but then the figure became clearer, and his heart froze in his chest. It was him, the dark version of himself. The same figure, the same eyes, the same twisted smile. But now it was more than just a reflection. It was real, and it was coming for him. "You can't escape me," the figure said, its voice dripping with malice. "You tried to run, but you can't outrun your own darkness." Elliot backed up, panic flooding through him. His legs felt weak, unsteady, as though the very ground beneath him was shifting with every step he took. He couldn't breathe. His chest tightened, the air growing thick with an unnatural pressure. "No, no, no!" Elliot shouted, his voice breaking. "Stay away from me. I won't let you." But the figure was already moving toward him, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. With each step, it seemed to grow larger, more imposing, until it was towering over Elliot, blocking out the light, its shadow stretching across the walls like a suffocating cloud. "You can't fight me, Elliot," the figure said, its voice echoing around him. "You are me. You can't escape what you are." Elliot's heart pounded in his chest as he stumbled backward, his mind racing. What was this place? What had happened to the world he knew? Was this real? Was any of this real? "I'm not you," Elliot gasped, his voice shaky. "I'm not you." The figure's lips curled into a twisted smile. "You are." Suddenly, the room shifted again, and the figure's form began to twist and distort. It became blurry, its features melting and warping into something even darker, more monstrous. Elliot's vision blurred as the room around him began to spin, the walls bending and twisting in on themselves like a funhouse of horrors. He could feel the figure's presence, closing in on him, suffocating him. It was everywhere now, its darkness suffusing the very air he breathed. He tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The room seemed to be pressing in on him from all sides, the darkness consuming him whole. And then the whisper came again, low and insistent, from the darkness itself. "You will never escape me, Elliot." Elliot's blood ran cold as the whisper wrapped around him like a vice, choking the life out of him. He was trapped. There was no way out. The darkness was all-consuming, and it had him in its grip. And as he struggled, as he fought to escape, he realized, too late, that there was nowhere to run. The door he had escaped through no longer existed. There was no escape from the darkness. There was no escape from himself. Elliot's body went rigid, his breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. His heart pounded as though it might burst from his chest. The suffocating pressure around him increased, and the whisper grew louder, almost deafening, filling his ears with its cold malice. "You will never escape me, Elliot." The words cut through him like a blade, each syllable sinking deeper into his mind. His hands trembled as he pressed them to his ears, trying to block out the voice, trying to force himself to wake up. But no matter how hard he fought, he couldn't escape. The darkness was all-encompassing, wrapping around him like a vice, pulling him deeper into its grip. The room, if you could even call it that, continued to twist and warp around him. The floor beneath his feet seemed to bend like rubber, undulating and shifting as though it were alive. The walls melted away, only to be replaced by more shadows, deeper and darker, suffocating him with their weight. He looked around desperately, trying to find something, anything, that could help him. But all he saw was the distorted figure of himself, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light, its twisted smile widening, showing too many teeth. "You can't hide from me," it hissed, the voice now coming from all directions. "You can't run from yourself." Elliot's legs gave way, and he fell to the ground, his mind spiraling. The world around him was spinning, the boundaries of reality bending and twisting in ways that felt too impossible to comprehend. It was like he was trapped in some kind of nightmare loop, each moment sinking deeper into madness. "You're mine now, Elliot," the figure said, its voice so close, it felt as if it was whispering directly into his ear. "I'm you. I'm what you've always been, buried deep inside. The darkness inside your soul. And now, I'm here to claim what's mine." Elliot closed his eyes, trying to block out the voice, but it was no use. The whispers continued to crawl under his skin, digging into his thoughts, into his very being. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. The darkness was consuming him, swallowing him whole, piece by piece. And then, through the overwhelming blackness, something changed. The suffocating pressure loosened, and the whispers began to fade, becoming distant and faint. Elliot's body, still trembling, slowly calmed as the oppressive weight lifted. His chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, his mind still reeling from the terror he had just experienced. Was it over? Had he woken up? Tentatively, Elliot opened his eyes. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he could see again. The darkness had receded, and the twisted figure of himself was gone. He was back in his apartment. But something was wrong. The room was different. The walls, the furniture, everything, it was all off. The colors were too vibrant, too sharp. The edges of the furniture seemed to bleed into each other, the shapes warping and distorting in ways that didn't make sense. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched unnaturally, reaching toward him like tendrils. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. He tried to move, to stand, but his body felt sluggish, as though his limbs were made of lead. The weight of his own thoughts bore down on him, a crushing, suffocating presence that was almost physical. And then, through the haze of confusion and fear, he saw it. The door. It was standing in the corner of his living room, just as it had been in the nightmare. The same wooden door, its surface scratched and weathered, as though it had been there for years. But this time, the door was different. It was no longer glowing with an eerie light. It was dark, its edges warped and twisted, as though it had been corrupted by the very darkness that had pursued him in his dream. "No," Elliot whispered, his voice barely audible as he took a hesitant step backward. He shook his head, trying to clear the fog in his mind. "This isn't real. This isn't real. I'm awake. I'm awake." But even as he spoke the words, a cold feeling of dread crawled up his spine. His instincts screamed at him to run, to escape, but his body wouldn't respond. It felt like the weight of the nightmare was still on him, lingering, suffocating him in the silence of his own apartment. The door creaked, as though something was pushing against it from the other side. The sound was soft at first, like a whisper, but it grew louder with each passing second. Elliot stood frozen, his heart hammering in his chest. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the door. He could feel it calling to him, beckoning him to open it, to step through it once again. "No," he muttered, more to himself than to the door. "I won't." But the door continued to groan, its hinges creaking louder, as if it were impatient. Elliot felt his breath catch in his throat as the handle began to turn, slowly, deliberately. He couldn't move. The door opened, and through the crack, Elliot saw it. The same dark version of himself, standing just beyond the threshold, eyes glowing with that same unnerving light. The twisted smile on his face stretched wider, almost inhuman. "You didn't think you could escape me, did you?" the figure said, its voice smooth and mocking. "You belong to me now, Elliot. You can't outrun your own darkness." Elliot's pulse raced as panic surged through him. He stumbled backward, trying to put distance between himself and the door. His mind screamed at him to run, to escape, but his body refused to cooperate. And then, from the darkness behind the door, a cold, haunting laugh echoed through the apartment. It was his laugh, but it wasn't. It was darker, crueler, more twisted. a laugh filled with malice, with a hunger that sent a chill down his spine. The figure stepped forward, its distorted form becoming clearer. Elliot's vision blurred, the room spinning around him, the walls bending and warping as if reality itself were cracking under the pressure of this terrible presence. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. He tried to move, but his body felt heavy, paralyzed. The figure reached out, its long fingers brushing against the doorframe as it stepped fully into the room. And when its eyes met Elliot's, he knew. He knew there was no escaping this time. The door had opened, and it wasn't just a doorway to another world. It was a doorway to himself. The figure took another slow, deliberate step toward him, its dark eyes glinting with a malevolent hunger. Elliot could feel it, the suffocating weight of inevitability, like an anchor pulling him deeper into the abyss. His heart hammered in his chest, his breath shallow and erratic. There was nowhere to run, no escape. As the figure neared, Elliot's thoughts scrambled, grasping for anything that might save him. He could feel the pull of the door, the weight of its darkness sinking into his skin. It was him. It was him in a way he couldn't comprehend. This twisted version of himself, born from his own deepest fears, was no longer a dream. It was standing in his reality, reaching for him. "Why?" Elliot gasped, his voice shaking as he looked into the abyss of those glowing eyes. "What do you want from me?" The figure's smile widened. "You're mine. You always have been. All of this, all of you, is me. You can't escape yourself, Elliot. You can never escape me. No matter where you run, no matter how far you go, I will always be there." Elliot's body trembled uncontrollably, his thoughts a swirl of panic. The walls of his apartment seemed to close in on him. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, and yet there was a strange calm that settled over him, a cold resignation. What if it was true? What if this dark version of himself was a part of him he could never escape? "You can't run anymore," the figure hissed, its voice like ice scraping against stone. "It's too late for that." Elliot's mind screamed. "This isn't real. This isn't real. I just need to wake up." But he knew it wasn't a dream. It couldn't be. The weight of the presence in the room, the chilling sensation crawling under his skin, told him this was far worse than any nightmare. This was real, and the longer he stared into the eyes of this dark reflection of himself, the more he realized that his fight had never been against it. It had always been against himself. With an abrupt motion, Elliot stumbled back, hands scrambling for anything solid to ground him. His fingers brushed the edge of a table, but it was no use. The room spun, the door swinging wider, its presence pulling him in. And then something shifted. The figure before him grew still. Its expression, his expression, twisted in realization. The eyes glowed brighter, a flicker of panic there. "No," it whispered. "You're not supposed to know." Elliot's blood ran cold as the words hit him like a hammer. "What do you mean?" But the figure didn't answer. Instead, it looked behind it, as though something in the room was changing, something it didn't expect. The very fabric of the world around them seemed to tremble, vibrating with an unseen force. And in that split second, Elliot understood. The door wasn't just a gateway to another life. It was a trap, a doorway to a version of himself that had been feeding on his fear, feeding on his mistakes, growing stronger with every visit. The figure before him wasn't just a twisted version of himself. It was the consequence of everything he had hidden, everything he had buried in the depths of his mind. And now it was free. Elliot took a deep breath, pushing past the fear that had paralyzed him. He wasn't going to let it win. He wouldn't let himself be consumed by this nightmare, by this twisted reflection of everything he feared. With every ounce of strength he could muster, he took a step forward, his eyes locking with the figure's. "You're not me," he said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his chest. "You're just a shadow, a ghost of my own making, and I will not let you take me." The figure faltered, its twisted smile faltering for the first time. There was a flicker of something, fear perhaps, or doubt, in its eyes. But before Elliot could react, the door behind it slammed shut with a deafening thud. The room fell silent. For a long, terrifying moment, Elliot stood there, frozen in place, his heart racing. The figure was gone. The door was gone. The oppressive darkness that had suffocated him for so long seemed to lift, leaving only a cold, eerie silence in its wake. Slowly, cautiously, Elliot allowed himself to breathe again. His hands were shaking, his legs weak, but he had done it. He had faced his fear. He had faced himself. The room was quiet now, normal, as though nothing had ever happened. The air, no longer thick with malevolence, felt almost too still, too peaceful. But Elliot knew better than to trust it. The door, though closed, had left its mark on him. It had shown him a truth he hadn't been ready to confront. He turned away from the spot where the door had been, his mind spinning. What had just happened? Was it over? He didn't know. But he did know one thing. He was not the same. And with that thought, Elliot took a hesitant step forward, leaving the darkness behind him. The door was gone for now. But as he walked away, a lingering feeling remained. The shadow of that twisted version of himself still clung to the edges of his mind. Was it really over? Or had he merely closed one door, only to open another? For Elliot, the truth was clear. There were no easy answers, no simple escapes. The door was always waiting, and no matter how far he ran, it would always be there. He had only just begun to understand the depths of the darkness inside, and it would always be with him. Ew. And that's the end of tonight's stories. Keep listening to the sound of rain and fall into a deep, peaceful sleep. Sweet dreams.